The year was 1879, when the Dakota Territory stretched vast and unforgiving before those seeking new beginnings. In these untamed plains, where winter brought both ethereal beauty and merciless brutality, courage was measured by survival, and compassion was as precious as gold itself. This is the extraordinary tale of Sarah Holloway, a grieving widow with a passion for knowledge, and Running Wolf, a Lakota hunter whose wisdom transcended the bitter boundaries that divided their worlds. Abandoned, desperate, and facing certain death in the harshest winter in decades, Sarah's journey would become a testament to human resilience and the profound connections that can form when all hope seems lost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The winter of 1879 descended upon the Dakota Plains with particular vengeance. From horizon to horizon, the landscape transformed into a sea of blinding white, its beauty masking deadly intent. Those who had survived previous winters knew to prepare well, to gather supplies, and to respect the power of the season. Snow fell in thick sheets, piling high against buildings and obscuring trails, while winds howled through the valleys with the ferocity of hungry wolves. In the small settlement of Whispering Pines, the residents huddled in their cabins, feeding, wood stoves and telling stories to keep the gloom at bay, all except for one household that sat at the edge of town, a modest dwelling with a thin plume of smoke rising from its chimney, growing fainter each day. Sarah Holloway stood at her window, her fingers tracing patterns in the frost that had formed on the inside of the glass. At 34, her face still held youthful softness, though grief had etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth. Her brown hair, usually pinned neatly, hung loose around her shoulders, and her blue eyes, once bright with enthusiasm, now carried the vacant look of someone who had lost their anchor in the world. 3 months, she whispered to herself, counting the days since her husband James had been laid to rest. The influenza that swept through Whispering Pines had taken him quickly, leaving Sarah alone in a community that had initially welcomed them for her teaching abilities, but now viewed her as a burden. The small woodpile by her door had dwindled, alarmingly. In the kitchen, her pantry held only a few cups of flour, a half jar of preserved peaches, and some dried beans. Not enough to last the season. Not nearly enough. A sharp knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Mrs. Holloway. "It's Mayor Everett. I need a word." Sarah smoothed her skirts and tucked her hair behind her ears before opening the door, allowing a blast of cold air to enter along with the portly figure of Horace Everett. "Mayor," she acknowledged with a polite nod. "Please come in." Everett stomped snow from his boots but remained standing near the door, making it clear this would not be a lengthy visit. His eyes, small and calculating, surveyed her dwindling firewood and the meager belongings that remained after Sarah had sold what she could to buy food. "Mrs. Holloway, I'll be direct. The town council met last night regarding your situation." Sarah steeled herself. Since James's death, the town council had become increasingly involved in her affairs, offering opinions she hadn't requested and solutions that benefited everyone but her. "And what did the council determine about my private matters this time?" she asked, unable to keep a note of bitterness from her voice. Everett's expression hardened. "Now, Sarah, there's no need for that tone. We're concerned citizens looking out for one of our own. The fact is, you can't sustain yourself here. Your teaching position was always meant to be temporary until we found someone more permanent." By permanent, Sarah knew he meant male. The town had made it clear that while a married woman might instruct children in a pinch, a widow was somehow less qualified, despite her education at Oberlin College. "The Wallace family is heading west to Fort Pierre tomorrow," Everett continued. "They've agreed to take you along. Samuel Wallace has connections there. Perhaps you could find work as a seamstress or housekeeper." "A seamstress?" Sarah repeated, incredulity rising in her voice. "Mayor Everett, I was brought to this town to establish your school. I've taught your children literature, mathematics, and science. I've introduced them to worlds beyond these plains, and now you suggest I abandon my calling to sew dresses." Everett shifted uncomfortably. "The situation has changed, Mrs. Holloway. Without your husband's carpentry income, and with the school position being filled by Mr. Davidson come spring." He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at her sparse home. "This is a generous offer. The Wallaces are good people." Sarah knew the Wallaces. Martha Wallace had made it abundantly clear she found Sarah's education unbecoming, and had been the first to withdraw her children from school after James's death, claiming they needed help on their farm, but really objecting to taking instruction from a widow. "And if I decline?" Sarah asked quietly. Everett's face reddened. "Then I'm afraid the town can't be responsible for what happens. Your supplies won't last the month, let alone the winter. We've all got families to care for, Mrs. Holloway. Charity has its limits." There it was, the threat wrapped in concern. "Take the offer or starve." Sarah felt a cold that had nothing to do with the winter seeping into her bones. "I need time to think," she said. "The Wallaces leave at first light," Everett replied, already turning toward the door. "Pack lightly. Their wagon will be full, and they're doing you a great courtesy." After he left, Sarah sank into her rocking chair, the one James had crafted as a wedding gift 5 years earlier. The memory of his hands, strong and sure as they shaped the wood, brought fresh grief welling up inside her. They had come west together, filled with hope and purpose. James would build, Sarah would teach, and together they would help build a community founded on more than mere survival. Now half of that dream lay buried in the frozen earth, and the other half was being stripped away by those who had once welcomed her abilities, but now saw only her vulnerability. Sarah spent the night in restless contemplation. The practical part of her mind urged acceptance of the Wallaces' offer. Fort Pierre was larger, with more opportunities perhaps, but her heart rebelled. The Wallaces were traveling to join Samuel's brother in land speculation. Their interests were purely financial, and their opinions on a woman's proper place were firmly traditional. Life with them would mean the death of her identity as an educator. By morning, she had made her decision. She would not go. When the Wallaces' wagon rolled past her home without stopping, Sarah felt a momentary panic. Had Mayor Everett even told them of her refusal? Had they simply assumed she wouldn't join them? She watched through frost-edged windows as the wagon disappeared into the swirling snow, feeling both relief and dread at the future that awaited her. 3 days later, Sarah's situation had grown desperate. The temperature had plummeted further, and her woodpile had dwindled to almost nothing. She had taken to wearing every piece of clothing she owned, layered against the cold that seemed to penetrate the very walls of her home. Her food supplies were critically low. On the 4th morning, she woke to find her water bucket frozen solid. The fire had died in the night, and her breath formed clouds in the frigid air of her bedroom. With trembling hands, she dressed and forced herself outside to gather the last of her firewood. The world beyond her door had transformed into something alien and hostile. Snow had drifted against the north wall of her home, nearly reaching the window. The path to town was completely obscured, though smoke rising from distant chimneys proved life continued there without her. As Sarah struggled to carry the last armload of wood inside, a figure appeared at the edge of her property. For a moment, hope flared that someone from town had come to check on her welfare. Then she recognized the tall, imposing silhouette of Elias Crawford, the local shopkeeper who had extended credit to her after James's death. Credit that had run out weeks ago. "Mrs. Holloway," Crawford called, trudging through the deep snow toward her. "Didn't expect to find you still here. Thought you'd gone with the Wallaces." Sarah clutched the wood tighter. "I declined their offer, Mr. Crawford." Crawford's weathered face registered surprise, then something closer to anger. "That wasn't wise, Ma'am. Not wise at all." He glanced at her dwindling woodpile. "I came to check if there might be anything of value left in the house. Mayor Everett mentioned you'd likely abandoned it, and there's the matter of your outstanding debt at my store." The boldness of his assumption that she would simply disappear, that her home and belongings would be forfeit, struck Sarah like a physical blow. "This is my property, Mr. Crawford. I've not abandoned anything." Crawford's expression hardened. "Property requires payment of taxes, Mrs. Holloway. Taxes I doubt you can afford. As for your debt, I will settle my debt," Sarah interrupted, summoning dignity despite her desperate circumstances. "But not by surrendering my home to scavengers." A dangerous look crossed Crawford's face. "Careful with your words, Mrs. Holloway. You've no protector now, and winter's just begun. Pride makes for cold comfort when the blizzards come." With that thinly veiled threat, he turned and trudged back toward town, leaving Sarah shaking, partly from cold, partly from fury, and partly from the terrible knowledge that he was right. She had food for perhaps another week, firewood for 3 days if she was careful, and no prospects for obtaining more of either. That night, as temperatures plunged to new depths and wind rattled her windows with increasing ferocity, Sarah faced the truth she had been avoiding. She would not survive. This winter alone. The town had made its decision about her value, and that decision amounted to abandonment. In the darkest hours before dawn, Sarah made a final, desperate plan. She would attempt to reach the next settlement, Hope's Crossing, some 15 miles, to the northwest. It was a perilous journey in good weather, potentially fatal in these conditions, but remaining meant certain death. By first light, she had packed everything she could carry. A small amount of food, James's hunting knife, matches wrapped carefully in oilcloth, an extra blanket, and his compass. She dressed in layers, wrapping a woolen scarf around her face and donning the fur-lined gloves James had traded for last winter. As Sarah stepped out into the bitter morning, a sense of finality washed over her. She might never see this home again. The home where she and James had laughed and loved and planned their future. Tears threatened to freeze on her cheeks as she whispered a goodbye to the life they had built and the dreams now buried with him. The journey began promisingly. Enough! Though the snow was deep, the storm had temporarily abated, leaving the landscape eerily still under a pale blue sky. Sarah oriented herself using James's compass, keeping the rising sun to her right as she pushed northwest toward Hope's Crossing. For the first few hours, determination drove her forward. She pictured the small but thriving settlement that had established a proper schoolhouse last year, imagining herself finding purpose there, rebuilding her life among people who might value her skills. But as midday approached, clouds began gathering. On the horizon, dark and ominous, the wind picked up, carrying the first biting flakes of a new storm. Sarah quickened her pace, though fatigue had already begun to set in, her legs leaden from pushing through snow that sometimes reached her knees. By early afternoon, the storm had engulfed her completely. Visibility reduced to mere feet in front of her, and the howling wind disoriented her sense of direction. Even with the compass, maintaining a straight course became nearly impossible as she was forced to detour around deep drifts and unseen obstacles beneath the snow. "Keep moving," she urged herself, James's voice seeming to echo in her mind. "To stop is to die." But as the short winter day began to fade, Sarah realized with growing horror that she was lost. The landmarks she had tried to memorize from James's old maps were obscured by the blizzard. Worse, her strength was failing rapidly. Each step required more effort than the last, and a dangerous warmth began to spread through her limbs despite the plummeting temperature. the first warning sign of hypothermia that James had once described. As darkness fell in earnest, Sarah stumbled upon a small copse of trees, barely more than a dozen pines clustered together, but offering minimal shelter from the driving snow. With the last of her strength, she crawled beneath the lowest branches of the largest tree, huddling against its trunk and wrapping her blanket tightly around herself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Just until the storm passes," she whispered, knowing even as the words left her lips that she was lying to herself. The storm showed no signs of abating, and even if it did, she had no clear idea of which direction to travel come mornings. The cold penetrated her layers of clothing, and the blanket that had seemed so substantial now felt paper-thin. Sarah's thoughts turned to James. Perhaps there was mercy in this end, a reunion with him beyond the veil of this life. Her eyelids grew heavy, the temptation to sleep nearly overwhelming. "Not yet," she murmured, forcing her eyes open. Not like this. But nature cared nothing for human determination. The blizzard raged on, depositing snow around her impromptu shelter, gradually encasing her in a tomb of white. Sarah's consciousness began to fade, her mind drifting into memories of warmer days, of students eager for knowledge, of James's smile, as he listened to her read aloud in the evenings. Just as her eyes closed for what she believed would be the final time, a sound penetrated the howling wind. Not the cry of wolves that she had feared might find her, but something rhythmic and deliberate. Footsteps approaching through the storm. Sarah forced her eyes open, straining to see through the curtain of snow. A dark silhouette materialized, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a confidence that defied the blizzard's fury. For a moment, her heart leapt with irrational hope. James somehow returned to her before reality reasserted itself. The figure paused, seemingly scanning the area, then moved with sudden purpose toward her hiding place. Sarah shrank back against the tree trunk, her numb fingers fumbling for James's knife. The dangers of the wilderness extended beyond cold and starvation. James had warned her of desperate men who roamed these territories, men to whom a lone woman would be merely another resource to exploit. The branches parted, and Sarah raised the knife with a hand that trembled from both fear and cold. The figure froze, observing her defensive posture. Then a deep voice spoke, calm and measured despite the raging storm. "You are far from any settlement, pale woman." The storm claimed many lives that night. In the dim light filtering through the snow-laden branches, Sarah could make out features that marked the stranger as Native American. Lakota, she guessed, from the distinctive pattern on the winter clothing he wore. His face, partially protected by a fur-lined hood, showed strength but also a weariness that matched her own. I lost my way," Sarah managed to say, her voice hoarse from cold and disuse. "I was trying to reach Hope's Crossing." The man regarded her silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Hope's Crossing lies many miles west. This path leads only to death in the snow." "I know that now," Sarah replied, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her voice. She still held the knife, though her grip had weakened as the reality of her situation reasserted itself. This man, stranger though he was, represented her only chance at survival. He seemed to assess her condition with a single glance. "You cannot stay here. The cold has already begun to claim you." Sarah knew he spoke the truth. The dangerous warmth spreading through her extremities, the confusion clouding her thoughts. These were the harbingers of freezing to death that James had described from his own wilderness experiences. "Can you stand?" the man asked, his tone neither unkind nor particularly compassionate, merely practical. Sarah nodded, though in truth she wasn't certain. As she attempted to rise, her legs buckled beneath her, numb from hours of immobility. In the cold, without comment, the stranger caught her arm, steadying her with surprising gentleness. "My shelter lies to the north," he said. "Not far, but the journey will be difficult in your condition. What is your name?" "Sarah," she replied, finding strange comfort in speaking it aloud after days of silence. "Sarah Holloway." He nodded once. "I am called Running Wolf among my people. The white settlers who trade at the fort know me as Wolf." He surveyed her critically. "You must walk if you can, Sarah Holloway. I will guide you." With that simple declaration, Sarah found herself entrusting her life to a man from a people she had been taught to fear, a man whose very presence in these territories represented resistance to the westward expansion that had brought her here. The irony was not lost on her, even in her weakened state. Running Wolf led the way, creating a path through the deep snow, occasionally reaching back to steady her when she faltered. He moved with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with this landscape, finding passages through drifts that would have been impassable to Sarah alone. They traveled in silence, save for his occasional instructions. "Step here, watch your footing, rest a moment," each delivered with the same economy of words that characterized everything about him. Sarah concentrated on placing one foot before the other, on remaining upright, on following the broad back that represented her only hope of survival. After what seemed like hours, but might have been less, the storm began to abate slightly, allowing brief glimpses of the terrain around them. They had entered a more densely wooded area, the trees providing some shelter from the wind and snow. In the distance, Sarah thought she glimpsed a faint glow, firelight perhaps. "We approach my winter camp," Running Wolf confirmed, noticing her change in attention. "The path grows steeper. Take care." Indeed, they began to ascend a gentle slope, the going more difficult as Sarah's strength continued to wane. Twice she stumbled, and twice Running Wolf's strong hand caught her before she could fall. The third time, her legs simply refused to support her anymore, buckling beneath her as darkness edged her vision. Without a word, Running Wolf knelt beside her. "I must carry you now," he stated simply. "The cold has taken too much of your strength." Before Sarah could protest, though what protest she could reasonably make, she wasn't sure. He had lifted her as easily as if she were a child, cradling her against his chest. The sudden warmth of another human body after hours of bitter cold sent a shock through her system, and she found herself instinctively curling closer, seeking the heat his sturdy frame provided. "My shelter lies just ahead," he reassured her, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Hold fast, Sarah Holloway. Your spirit is stronger than this storm." As consciousness faded and her head came to rest against his shoulder, Sarah's last coherent thought was that perhaps death had indeed found her, but it had come in a form very different from what she had imagined. Not the cold embrace of winter, but the strong arms of a stranger whose kindness defied the boundaries between their worlds. Sarah drifted through layers of consciousness, caught between the numbing embrace of winter and fleeting sensations of warmth. Her dreams were fragmented. James calling her name, students reciting poetry, Mayor Everett's cold dismissal, and through it all, the howling of a storm that seemed to have no end. When awareness finally returned, it came in stages. First the crackling of fire, then the scent of something rich and unfamiliar cooking, and finally the realization that she lay wrapped in soft furs rather than frozen beneath a pine tree. She opened her eyes to find herself in a shelter unlike any she had seen before. Not quite a cabin, not exactly a tent, but something in between, a sturdy wooden framework covered in what appeared to be hides, the entire structure radiating a surprising warmth from the small fire pit at its center. The smoke rose to a hole in the roof, cleverly designed to draw it upward without letting in the snow that she could still hear falling outside. "You return to the living," the voice startled her. Running Wolf sat cross-legged on the opposite side of the fire, his hands busy with what looked like a hunting trap he was repairing. In the firelight, she could see his features more clearly: strong cheekbones, deep-set eyes that reflected the flames, hair worn longer than white men's but tied back practically. He wore buckskin clothing adorned with subtle beadwork, functional rather than decorative. "How long?" Sarah asked, her voice a rasp that barely carried across the small space. "2 suns," he replied, setting aside his work. "The fever of the cold took you. I thought perhaps your spirit had decided to journey onward." 2 days. She had lost 2 days to the cold. Sarah attempted to sit up, only to find her limbs unnervingly weak, as if she'd suffered a long illness rather than simply slept. "Slowly," Running Wolf cautioned, rising to bring her a wooden cup filled with a steaming liquid. "Your body remembers the cold. It will take time to forget." The cup warmed her hands pleasantly as she inhaled the unfamiliar aroma, some kind of broth with herbs she couldn't identify. When she sipped cautiously, the flavor surprised her, rich and earthy, with a slight bitterness that was not unpleasant. "This is good," she murmured, taking another sip. "Thank you for this and for—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing the shelter, the fire, her continued existence. "Everything." Running Wolf nodded once in acknowledgement, returning to his place by the fire. "The winter shows no mercy to those unprepared. Why did you travel alone in such weather?" The question was direct, without judgment, simply seeking information. Sarah found herself explaining her situation: James's death, the town's withdrawal of support, her desperate attempt to reach Hope's Crossing. Running Wolf listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Your people abandoned one of their own," he said when she finished, the statement flat but carrying an undercurrent of something, not quite anger, but perhaps disapproval. "They saw no value in keeping me," Sarah replied, unable to keep bitterness from her voice. "A widow who teaches children has little purpose in their eyes." Running Wolf seemed to consider this. "The Lakota value wisdom and those who share it. A teacher would not be cast out, even among the poorest band." His words, though simply stated, carried a weight that made Sarah's throat tighten with emotion. The validation of her worth, something Whispering Pines had systematically stripped away, came unexpectedly from a man whose people were portrayed as savages in the newspapers that occasionally reached their settlement. "The storm continues," Running Wolf said, changing the subject. 3 days now, the worst I have seen in many winters. "Will your supplies last?" Sarah asked, suddenly conscious that she represented an additional burden on resources that had been meant for one. A hint of amusement crossed his face. "I prepare well for winter moons. My people do not settle in one place during warm seasons. We follow the buffalo, gather plants, dry meat and berries. Winter camps are stocked to last until spring thaw." He ladled more of the broth into a wooden bowl for himself, the firelight catching the careful craftsmanship of the utensil. "Rest today. Tomorrow, if you are stronger, I will show you this place. It has been my winter camp for 5 seasons." Sarah nodded, still overwhelmed by the strangeness of her situation. "Why did you save me?" she asked suddenly. "You could have left me. Many would have." Running Wolf looked up from his meal, his dark eyes meeting hers directly across the fire. "Would you have left someone to die in the snow if you had the means to help them?" "No," Sarah admitted, "but I'm not—" She trailed off, uncertain how to express the thought without giving offense. "Not Lakota," he finished for her, his expression unchanged. "And I am not white. Yet the storm does not ask what. Color skin freezes beneath it. The wolf does not care what language is spoken by the flesh it hunts. We are all simply human before the winter. The profound simplicity of his worldview silenced her. Sarah finished her broth, feeling strength gradually returning to her limbs. As the day progressed, she drifted in and out of sleep, her body demanding rest to recover from its ordeal. Each time she woke, Running Wolf was engaged in some task, preparing food, mending equipment, carving what appeared to be a small wooden animal from a piece of pine. By evening, Sarah felt well enough to sit up properly, wrapped in the fur blanket he had provided. The storm continued unabated outside, its howling a constant reminder of the fate she had narrowly escaped. Running Wolf prepared a more substantial meal, some kind of stew with dried meat and wild roots that tasted better than anything Sarah had eaten since James died. "Your shelter," she said as they ate. "It's remarkable. I've never seen anything like it." "It is called a teepee among my people," he explained. "Not our summer dwelling. Those are larger, made to be moved when we follow the buffalo. This is smaller, reinforced for winter storms. The frame is lodgepole pine. The covering buffalo hide is treated to keep out wind and rain." "You built this alone?" she asked, impressed by the craftsmanship. Running Wolf nodded. "5 winters ago. Each year I return, strengthen what has weakened, replace what has worn. It becomes stronger with time." Something in his tone suggested he spoke of more than just the shelter. Sarah found herself curious about this man who lived between worlds, clearly maintaining Lakota traditions while also interacting enough with white settlements to speak excellent English and understand their ways. "You mentioned the fort," she said cautiously. "Do you trade there?" "Sometimes. I guide for the army when they pay well. I understand the land, the weather, the movement of people. Information has value." His pragmatism surprised her. "Isn't that," she hesitated, "difficult, given the tensions between your people and the army?" Running Wolf's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, a complexity of emotion she couldn't decipher. "The world changes. The buffalo grow. Fewer. The white settlements spread like prairie fire. My band follows the old ways, but we must also understand the new ones to survive." He set down his empty bowl. "I learned your language at the mission school when I was young. Later, I served as translator for chiefs who spoke with army leaders. Now, I walk between both worlds, trusted completely by neither." The loneliness implied by that statement resonated with Sarah's own sense of displacement. She too existed in a space between expectations, too educated to be accepted as a proper frontier wife, yet unable to claim the professional status a man with her qualifications would receive without question. "That must be difficult," she offered, quietly. Running Wolf made a non-committal gesture. "It is the path I walk. Each path has stones that bruise the feet." Their conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as the fire burned low. Outside, the storm seemed to gain new strength, the wind battering the teepee with fresh determination. Despite its fury, the structure held firm, barely trembling under the assault. "Will sleep come easier tonight?" Running Wolf asked, noting Sarah's attention to the storm. "I think so," she replied, though in truth the howling wind still carried echoes of her near-death experience. "Though the storm's voice is difficult to forget." "Then listen to another voice instead," he suggested. To her surprise, he began to speak in a rhythmic cadence, words flowing in his native Lakota. Though she couldn't understand their meaning, the sound was mesmerizing, rising and falling like the prairie grasses under summer wind, strong yet soothing. "What is that?" she asked when he paused. "A winter story," he explained, "about how Coyote stole fire from the mountain spirits to warm the people during the first winter. My grandfather told me on nights like this, when the wind tried to claim our attention." "It's beautiful," Sarah said sincerely. Would you tell it in English? I'd like to understand." Something like approval flickered across Running Wolf's face. He settled more comfortably before the fire and began to translate the tale, his voice taking on the same rhythmic quality despite the change in language. Sarah listened, entranced, as he wove the story of Coyote's cleverness, the anger of the mountain spirits, and the gratitude of the people who received the gift of fire. When he finished, the storm still raged, but Sarah found she could hear it. Differently now, not as the voice of death narrowly escaped, but as merely the backdrop to this unexpected moment of connection across cultures. "Your people have many such stories?" she asked. Running Wolf nodded. "Stories teach everything. How to live, how to hunt, how to respect the spirits, how to understand the world. They are how wisdom passes from grandparent to child." "Not so different from my work then," Sarah observed. "Teaching is about stories. 2. The story of numbers and how they dance together. The story of words and how they build bridges between minds. The story of the past and how it shapes our present." For the first time, she saw Running Wolf smile, a brief softening of his usually stoic expression that transformed his entire face. "Perhaps teachers are valued among my people, because we understand that stores carry life," he said. "Without them, we are merely flesh that walks and breathes." That night, Sarah slept deeply despite the continuing storm, Running Wolf's story having replaced her fear with something approaching wonder. When she woke the next morning, she found the teepee quiet. The howling wind had finally ceased, and Running Wolf was absent. Concern flickered briefly until she noticed his weapons still hung on their pegs. He hadn't gone far. With effort, she rose and dressed in her own clothes, which had been carefully dried and folded near her sleeping place. Her strength had returned considerably, though she still felt the lingering effects of her ordeal in trembling hands and aching muscles. The teepee's entrance flap moved aside, admitting a blast of cold air and Running Wolf, carrying an armload of firewood. Frost rimmed his eyelashes and the fur of his hood, but his movements were as efficient and purposeful as ever. "The storm has passed," he announced, kneeling to rebuild the fire, "but the snow is deep, deeper than a tall man in some places where it has drifted." Sarah's heart sank as the implications became clear. "Then Hope's Crossing is unreachable," he confirmed, "until the snow melts enough for travel. Weeks, perhaps a moon or more." The reality of her situation settled heavily upon her. She was alive, yes, but still stranded, dependent on the continued goodwill of a man who owed her nothing, in a shelter barely large enough for one person, let alone two. "I've imposed on your kindness too much already," she began, but Running Wolf cut her off with a raised hand. "Winter is not a time for traveling alone," he said firmly. "That path leads only to death, as you have already discovered. You will remain here until safe passage is possible." His tone brooked no argument, though his expression remained free. Of resentment, he was simply stating what he saw as the only rational option. "How can I repay such generosity?" Sarah asked, genuinely at a loss. Running Wolf considered her for a moment as he fed small sticks to the growing flames. "You are a teacher," he said finally. "Perhaps you can teach." "Teach? But what could I speak your language." "Yes," he interrupted, "but I do not read or write it well. These skills have value when dealing with white traders and army officers. They respect paper words more than spoken ones." Understanding dawned. "You want me to teach you to read and write English?" He nodded. "A fair exchange. I provide shelter and food. You provide knowledge. Both necessary for survival, yes? Put that way, it seemed perfectly reasonable." Sarah found herself smiling for what felt like the first time in months. "Yes, that seems fair. Though I have no books, no paper." "After we eat," Running Wolf said, returning to his practical manner, "I will show you what is possible." The meal was simple but nourishing. Dried meat softened in hot water with some kind of wild onion added for flavor. Afterward, Running Wolf brought forth a small wooden box, carefully wrapped in oiled hide to protect it from moisture. Inside were several items that astonished Sarah. A small blank journal bound in leather, a pencil, and most surprising of all, a well-worn copy of Robinson Crusoe. "From Fort Pierre," he explained, seeing her expression. "The army captain gave me the book as part of payment for guiding his men through Lakota hunting grounds. The journal and pencil were from a trader who needed help finding his way back to the Missouri River when spring floods changed the landscape." Sarah ran her fingers reverently over the book's cover. "This is perfect for teaching. It's about a man who must survive alone in a strange place, using his wits and the skills he learns." Running Wolf's expression suggested this was not new information. "I know the story. The trader told me what it contained. That is why I accepted it, though I could only understand parts where the words were simple." "You've been trying to teach yourself," Sarah realized, noting how the book's pages showed signs of careful handling. He nodded. "Knowledge is a weapon sharper than any knife, more powerful than any rifle. The Lakota understand this. That is why our children learn the old stories, the plant lore, the star paths. Now we must also learn new knowledge to survive in the changing world." His pragmatism impressed Sarah. Where many might resist unfamiliar ways out of pride or fear, Running Wolf seemed to evaluate knowledge purely on its usefulness, without concern for its origin. "We'll start today," she decided, energized by the prospect of teaching again, of being useful. "But first, you mentioned showing me this place?" Running Wolf nodded, rising to collect 2 pairs of what looked like oversized wooden frames with webbing woven across them. "Snowshoes," he explained, handing her the smaller pair. "Otherwise we would sink to our necks in the new snow." He showed her how to secure them to her boots, then demonstrated the altered gait necessary for walking in them, a wider stance and slightly rolling motion that felt awkward at first, but became more natural with practice. When he deemed her proficient enough not to exhaust herself immediately, they ventured outside. The world beyond the teepee had transformed into something so pristine and vast that Sarah caught her breath at the sight. Snow blanketed everything, smoothing the landscape into gentle curves that sparkled blindingly in the morning sun. The teepee stood in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, their branches heavily laden with white. "It's beautiful," she whispered, momentarily forgetting the deadly nature of this same beauty just days before. "Beauty and danger often walk hand in hand," Running Wolf observed, correctly reading her thoughts. "The most beautiful flowers sometimes carry the deadliest poison. The most beautiful weather often precedes the worst storms." He pointed toward a ridge visible in the distance. "From there, on clear days, you can see the smoke from Fort Pierre, 20 miles perhaps, as birds fly. More by land with rivers and valleys to cross." He turned, indicating the opposite direction. "Whispering Pines lies that way, beyond those hills, closer, but still too far for safe winter travel." Sarah followed his gesture, surprised to find she felt no longing at the mention of the settlement. That had cast her out. Only a dull ache for the home she and James had built there, now likely claimed by Elias Crawford in payment of her debts. Running Wolf led her in a careful circuit around the immediate area, pointing out features she would need to recognize. The stream, now frozen, but marked by a slight depression in the snow. The woodpile, covered with hides, weighted with stones. The small smokehouse where strips of deer and buffalo meat hung preserving. And most importantly, a series of rope guides strung between trees. "If snow comes again, or if fog descends, these will lead you back to the teepee," he explained. "Always keep one hand on the rope if visibility fails. Let go, and the prairie becomes a maze with no solution." The careful preparations spoke of years of experience and a deep respect for the environment's dangers. Sarah realized that Running Wolf's survival wasn't luck or simple instinct. It was the result of meticulous planning, accumulated knowledge, and constant awareness. As they completed their circuit and returned to the teepee, Sarah found herself overwhelmed with gratitude, not just for her rescue, but for this glimpse into a way of life that respected and adapted to the land rather than attempting to conquer it. "Thank you," she said simply as they removed their snowshoes at the teepee entrance, "for sharing this with me." Running Wolf met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "You see with different eyes than most white women," he observed. "You look to understand, not just to judge." "Perhaps that's what teaching requires," Sarah replied. "The willingness to see the world through many different eyes." Inside the teepee, they settled by the rekindled fire, the copy of Robinson Crusoe open between them. As Sarah began to assess Running Wolf's existing knowledge of written English, she realized that this unexpected winter arrangement offered something she had thought lost forever after James's death and Whispering Pine's rejection: purpose. Here, in this small shelter far from any settlement, two people from vastly different worlds had found a connection based on the most fundamental of human activities, the sharing of knowledge. As the short winter day progressed into evening and they continued their first lesson, Sarah felt something within her begin to thaw, something that had frozen long before her desperate journey through the blizzard. Outside, the temperature dropped again as darkness fell, but inside the teepee, warmth emanated from more than just the dancing flames of the central fire. It radiated from the growing understanding between teacher and student, from the bridge being built word by careful word across the divide of their different worlds. Days melded into a rhythm as January deepened its grip on the Dakota plains. Sarah and Running Wolf established a routine that made the most of daylight hours and the confined space they shared. Mornings began before dawn, with Running Wolf rekindling the central fire, while Sarah folded the sleeping furs and prepared a simple breakfast from their carefully rationed supplies. Their days were filled with purposeful activity. There was no room for idleness in winter survival. Running Wolf taught Sarah to maintain the teepee, showing her how to check the hides for areas where frost might penetrate, how to bank the fire to provide maximum warmth with minimum fuel, and how to predict weather changes by observing subtle shifts in the smoke's direction as it rose through the smoke hole. "The wind speaks to those who listen," he explained one morning, pointing to the thin column of smoke that bent sharply to the east before dispersing. "Today, it is clear skies but bitter cold. By evening, the stars will seem close enough to touch." Sarah marveled at these insights that came from generations of close observation, knowledge no textbook in her previous life had contained. In exchange, she devoted several hours each day to teaching Running Wolf to read and write English with greater proficiency. He proved to be a remarkably quick student, his existing knowledge providing a foundation she could build upon rapidly. "Your mind grasps patterns quickly," she observed after he mastered a particularly difficult passage from Robinson Crusoe. "Many of my students in Whispering Pines would have struggled for weeks with what you've learned in days." Running Wolf considered this as he carefully traced letters in the small journal. Lakota children learn to read the land from earliest. Walking, where water flows beneath snow, which plants heal and which harm, how animals move before storms approach. Perhaps seeing patterns is not so different, whether in tracks on the ground or marks on paper. This perspective, drawing connections between his traditional knowledge and the new skills he sought, fascinated Sarah. As a teacher, she had always believed in building bridges between the familiar and the unknown, but never had she seen a student forge these connections with such natural insight. By the end of their second week together, Running Wolf could read substantial portions of text without assistance and write simple but clear messages. His progress gave Sarah a sense of accomplishment she had sorely missed since losing her position. At the school, in turn, Running Wolf's lessons extended beyond basic survival skills. He began teaching Sarah to identify useful plants preserved in his carefully maintained storage, which roots could be used for medicine, which berries provided vital nourishment through winter months, and which herbs added flavor to otherwise bland, preserved foods. "This is a bearberry," he explained one afternoon, showing her a small pouch of dried red berries. "Good for fever and water sickness. This," he indicated another container with fragrant dried leaves. "Wild mint. Clears the chest when breathing becomes difficult." Sarah ran her fingers through the leaves, releasing their sharp, clean scent. "My mother used mint tea for chest colds," she remarked. "Some knowledge seems universal." Running Wolf nodded. "Many plants speak to all peoples in the same voice. Others keep their secrets unless approached with proper respect." He replaced the containers carefully. "When spring comes, I will show you how they grow, where to find them." The casual mention of spring, still months away, caught Sarah by surprise. It implied a continuation of their association beyond the immediate crisis, something she had carefully avoided considering. What future awaited her when the snow melted? The question lingered, unasked but increasingly present as January gave way to February. Their evenings established their own pattern. After the day's work and lessons concluded, they would share the main meal, carefully prepared to provide nourishment while conserving their stores. Then, as the fire burned low and darkness wrapped around the teepee, they would exchange stories. Running Wolf sharing Lakota legends that explained the origins of constellations or the changing seasons. Sarah recounting tales from the books she had cherished since childhood or histories she had taught her students. On one such evening, as a particularly bitter cold snap held the prairie in its grip, Running Wolf asked a question that had apparently been on his mind. "The settlement that rejected you, were all your days there unhappy?" Sarah looked up from the small piece of deerskin she was learning to soften using techniques Running Wolf had demonstrated. The question stirred memories she had been avoiding. "No," she admitted softly, "there were good days. When James was alive, we had purpose. The school was new, the children eager. Some parents valued education highly. Frontier life requires practical knowledge, but many settlers still dream of their children having better opportunities." She set aside her work, lost in recollection. The first Christmas at the school, the children performed a pageant. They had memorized poems and songs. Parents who barely spoke to each other put aside differences to attend. For that one evening, I glimpsed what the community could become at its best. Running Wolf listened attentively, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "And after your husband's passing?" Sarah's expression clouded. "Everything changed. It was as if his death gave permission for opinions that had been hidden to surface. The school board, all men of course, began questioning my methods, my curriculum. Parents who had praised my teaching suddenly worried about their children. Being instructed by a woman in mourning." The bitterness she had suppressed rose unexpectedly, as if grief somehow contaminated knowledge. "Your people fear death," Running Wolf observed matter-of-factly. "They hide it away, speak of it in whispers, as if it might be catching a fever." The insight struck Sarah with its accuracy. "Yes," she agreed. "They treated me as if widowhood were a disease rather than a natural part of life's journey." She looked at him curiously. "The Lakota view death differently?" Running Wolf was silent for a moment, considering his words carefully. "We do not welcome death before its time, but neither do we pretend it is not the companion of all living things. When a person walks to the spirit world, we honor their journey with ceremony. We keep their memory through stories. The living must continue living. This is how we respect those who have gone ahead." The wisdom in this approach moved Sarah deeply. No one in Whispering Pines had allowed her to speak of James after the funeral. Mention of him brought uncomfortable silence or hasty changes of subject, as if remembering him might somehow prolong Her grief rather than help her carry it. "Would you tell me about him?" Running Wolf asked unexpectedly. "The man whose absence shapes your path?" The simple invitation to remember, to share, to speak James's name aloud, broke something open inside Sarah. Words began to flow, hesitantly at first, then with growing animation as she described the man she had loved. His skill with wood, his gentle humor, his belief in education despite having little formal schooling himself, his dreams of building a proper life on the frontier. Running Wolf listened without interruption, his face showing neither impatience nor discomfort as she spoke of love and loss with equal measure. When she finally fell silent, emotional but somehow lighter for having given voice to her memories, he offered no platitudes, only quiet acknowledgement. "He walks with the ancestors now, but his spirit lives in your words. This is good." That night, as Sarah drifted towards sleep wrapped in furs that kept the deepening cold at bay, she realized something had shifted between them. The simple act of bearing witness to her grief, neither minimizing it nor being consumed by it, had created a deeper level of trust than mere survival cooperation had established. The following morning brought a new challenge. Sarah woke to find Running Wolf already dressed for outdoor travel, checking his hunting equipment with methodical care. "The meat stores grow low," he explained when he noticed her watching. "I must hunt today while the weather holds clear." Alarm flickered through Sarah at the prospect of being left alone. Though she had mastered basic tasks around the teepee, the wilderness beyond remained a formidable threat, especially to someone raised in eastern settlements. Running Wolf seemed to read her concern. "You have learned much," he said reassuringly. "The fire will keep, the teepee will protect you. I will return before darkness falls." "Of course," Sarah replied, embarrassed by her momentary panic. "What should I do while you're gone?" Running Wolf considered. "Practice the skills we have discussed. Prepare more of the inner bark strips for fiber work." He hesitated, then added, "And perhaps write in the journal. Your thoughts, your memories. Paper holds what the mind might lose." The suggestion surprised her, both for its sensitivity and its practicality. Running Wolf had come to understand her need for meaningful activity, not just physical tasks. After a brief meal and final preparations, he departed, snowshoes leaving distinct tracks that led away from the teepee and into the surrounding forest. Sarah stood at the entrance until his figure disappeared among the trees, then turned resolutely to the day's tasks. She began by carefully feeding the central fire, adding wood in the pattern Running Wolf had taught her to maintain consistent heat. Next, she checked the teepee's perimeter, ensuring no weak points had developed in the structure. Satisfied with its condition, she turned to the inner bark strips that needed to be softened for future use in creating cordage. The repetitive nature of the work allowed her mind to wander. For the first time since her rescue, Sarah found herself truly alone with her thoughts, without the immediate presence of her unexpected benefactor. She realized how quickly she had grown accustomed to his company, the quiet assurance he brought to every task, the unexpected insights that often emerged from his observations, even the comfortable silences that frequently settled between them. What would happen when winter released its grip on the prairie? The question that had hovered at the edges of her consciousness now demanded consideration. Her original plan to reach Hope's Crossing seemed both naive and increasingly unnecessary. The town had been merely a destination chosen out of desperation. She had no connections there, no guarantee of welcome. Sarah paused in her work, struck by a realization. In the 6 weeks since James's death, she had experienced more rejection than in her entire previous life, yet also more genuine acceptance. Running Wolf had offered shelter and knowledge without condition, seeing value in what she could contribute rather than limitations in what she could not. The contrast with whispering. Pine's treatment could not have been more stark. There, her education had become a liability after widowhood, her independence a threat to established order. Here, in a simple teepee miles from any settlement, her knowledge was respected, her capacity for learning new skills encouraged. As promised, she turned to the journal after completing her other tasks. The blank pages seemed intimidating at first. What thoughts deserved permanence? And after hesitation, she began writing, not a structured narrative, but impressions and reflections, observations about the winter landscape, notes on skills she had learned, memories of James that she wanted to preserve, and increasingly thoughts about the man whose absence now felt tangible in the small shelter. The day passed more quickly than she had anticipated. When the light began to fade, Sarah added more wood to the fire and moved to the teepee entrance, scanning the tree line for signs of Running Wolf's return. As minutes stretched into an hour, with no sign of him, concern began to build. What if he had encountered trouble? A hunting accident, hostile travelers, or simply the unforgiving cold that could claim even the most experienced outdoorsman? Just as she was considering her limited options, she could hardly set out to search for him. A movement at the forest edge caught her attention. Running Wolf emerged from the trees, moving more slowly than usual, dragging what appeared to be a travois laden with his hunt. Sarah quickly donned her outer garments and hurried to meet him, relief washing over her at his safe return. As she drew closer, she could see the reason for his labored pace. The travois carried a young deer, already field-dressed, but still a substantial burden to transport alone through deep snow. "Let me help," she called, reaching him as he paused. To adjust his grip on the travois handles, Running Wolf looked up, surprise briefly crossing his features before he nodded acceptance of her offer. Together they managed the final distance to the teepee more easily, working in tandem to navigate the snow-covered ground. "Successful hunt," Sarah observed as they reached the shelter. "The spirits were generous," Running Wolf agreed, his breath forming clouds in the chill air. "This will see us through many days." The use of us rather than me was not lost on Sarah. Whatever their differences in background, experience, and culture, they had become a unit of sorts, bound by circumstance, but increasingly by choice as well. The next hours were consumed with processing the deer properly. Nothing could be wasted when survival depended on making maximum use of every resource. Running Wolf showed Sarah how to help prepare the meat for preservation, explaining each step with patient detail. "The tendons will be dried for sinew," he demonstrated, carefully removing and setting aside specific parts. "Stronger than any thread your people make. The hide will need careful tanning, but will provide material for moccasins, perhaps a winter hood for you." Sarah worked alongside him, initially clumsy but increasingly confident as she followed his instructions. The work was messy and would have horrified the proper women of Whispering Pines, but she found satisfaction in its essential purpose. This was not genteel needlework to decorate a home. It was necessary labor that directly contributed to survival. As they worked into the evening, Sarah described her day alone, including her time writing in the journal. Running Wolf listened attentively, seeming pleased that she had used the solitude productively. "Words on paper," he mused as they finally settled by the fire, exhausted but content with the day's accomplishments. "My people keep our stories in. Memory passed from one generation to the next. Your people trap words like animals, hold them still on pages." "I never thought of it that way," Sarah admitted, intrigued by the comparison. "Is one better than the other?" Running Wolf considered the question seriously. Different paths to the same destination. Memory breathes, changes with each telling. Writing stays fixed, but survives even when no one remains who remembers. He gestured toward the book of Robinson Crusoe. "Those words were set down before either of us walked this earth. The man who wrote them is long dead, yet his thoughts still speak." "That's why I became a teacher," Sarah said softly. Books allowed me to hear voices from the past, to learn from minds I could never meet in person. I wanted to give that gift to others. Running Wolf nodded thoughtfully. Teaching is honored work among the Lakota. Those who know the old ways must share them, or the knowledge dies with them. He paused, then added, "Perhaps when the snow melts, there will be children who would value your teaching." The comment, casually offered, opened a door Sarah had not considered. Lakota children, you mean? Some bands camp near Fort Pierre. In spring, they trade meat with officials. Running Wolf's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held a question. Some seek to understand white ways, white words. A teacher who respects both worlds might find welcome there. The possibility stunned Sarah, not because it seemed outlandish, but because it felt so unexpectedly right. Teaching had never been merely employment to her, but vocation. The idea that her skills might find purpose in a context she had never imagined was both disorienting and exhilarating. Would that be possible? She asked cautiously. A white woman teaching Lakota children. The path between worlds is never easy, Running Wolf replied, echoing words he had spoken before. But those who walk it create new possibilities. He added, more wood to the fire, watching the flames rise before continuing. Much would depend on the teacher. If she came with respect, with willingness to learn as well as teach. He left the thought unfinished, but its implications hung in the air between them. Sarah found herself imagining a future neither Whispering Pines nor her previous life had prepared her to envision. One where her identity as a teacher might continue, but in service to building understanding across the very boundaries that had seemed insurmountable before the winter began. As February progressed, their days fell into a pattern that balanced survival needs with increasing skills exchange. Running Wolf expanded Sarah's instruction beyond basic wilderness knowledge to include Lakota perspectives on the land, seasons, and animals. He taught her simple phrases in his language, correcting her pronunciation with unexpected patience. Return. Sarah's lessons ventured beyond reading and writing to include mathematics, geography, and history, subjects Running Wolf approached with the same pragmatic interest he showed in all forms of knowledge that might prove useful. Your people's numbers are powerful tools, he observed, after mastering a particularly complex calculation. They allow counting of things not yet seen, planning for what has not yet happened. Mathematics helps us predict and prepare, Sarah agreed. Though I think your weather prediction from watching smoke patterns may be more immediately useful in daily life than calculating geometric progressions. This drew one of Running Wolf's rare smiles, brief but genuine expressions that transformed his usually solemn countenance. These moments had become something Sarah unconsciously worked toward, taking quiet satisfaction when her observations or occasional attempts at humor elicited this response. One afternoon, as they worked together to repair a tear in one of the tippy covers, Running Wolf unexpectedly asked, "Do you miss your old life, the settlement, the comforts of white ways?" Sarah's hands stilled on the sinew she was threading through carefully punched holes in the hide. The question required honest reflection. "I miss certain things," she acknowledged. "Books, primarily. My small library was precious to me. Volumes I'd collected since childhood, carried west at considerable effort." She resumed her stitching, considering further. "I miss the piano at the church, though I was only permitted to play it for Sunday services. And sometimes I miss conversations about ideas, about the wider world beyond these plains." Running Wolf nodded, accepting these answers without judgment. "And people beyond your husband's memory?" Sarah's expression clouded. There were a few, the blacksmith's wife who shared her bread recipes, 2 or 3 families who valued education enough to defend my teaching methods. But true friendship? That proved rarer than I expected. She tied off a length of sinew, her movements now practiced after weeks of learning. Whispering pines revealed its true nature when adversity came. I cannot miss what was proven hollow. They worked in silence for several minutes before Sarah gathered courage to ask her own question. And you? Do you miss your people when you winter alone? Running Wolf's hands remained steady at his task, but something shifted in his expression, a brief vulnerability quickly masked. My band travels with the seasons, following traditional ways. I chose a different path, learning white languages, serving as guide and translator, living between worlds. His voice held no self-pity, only a statement of fact. This creates distance. They disapprove? Sarah asked gently. Some do. Others see necessity in having one who understands both sides. He secured the final stitches in the repair before adding, My father was a respected warrior. He wished me to follow that path. When I chose knowledge over war, it created a shadow between us. The personal disclosure, rare from a man who spoke primarily of practical matters or traditional teachings, touched Sarah deeply. She understood the courage required to choose one's own path against family expectations. Her own decision to pursue higher education had created similar tensions, particularly with her mother, who had envisioned a more conventional life for her only daughter. Yet you return to them, she observed. They are my people, Running Wolf said simply. Different paths do not change shared blood, shared history. He gathered the repaired hide, apparently considering his next words carefully. But perhaps there are many ways to honor one's people. Teaching their children to navigate the changing world might be one such way. The reference to their previous conversation about Sarah potentially teaching Lakota children was unmistakable. The possibility had continued to develop in her mind over the intervening days, growing from abstract concept to potential future that both frightened and intrigued her. As they restored the repaired section of the teepee covering to its proper place, securing it against the still, bitter February winds, Sarah realized how much had changed in her perception of what constituted meaningful life. The comforts and conventions of her previous existence now seemed less essential than she had once believed. What remained vitally important was purpose, the opportunity to contribute, to share knowledge, to grow in understanding. Whether that purpose might be fulfilled among Lakota children near Fort Pierre, in some other settlement yet unknown, or perhaps even in continued association with the quiet, thoughtful man who had saved her life, remained unclear. But for the first time since James's death and her subsequent abandonment, Sarah felt something like hope when she contemplated the future, not just survival, but the possibility of a life rebuilt on new and unexpected foundations. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing the day's final meal, a comfortable silence settled between them, the kind of quiet that comes not from absence of words, but from their diminished necessity. In the flickering light, Sarah studied Running Wolf's profile as he gazed thoughtfully into the flames, struck by how familiar his features had become in the relatively brief span of their acquaintance. More than familiarity, she realized with a sudden clarity that both alarmed and exhilarated her. In this man from a world so different from her own, she had found something she had not expected to discover again after James's death. Connection that transcended mere circumstance, understanding that required no explanation, and perhaps most surprising, the first stirrings of feelings she had believed permanently extinguished by grief. The realization remained unspoken, held close like the embers banked at night to preserve their heat until morning. But its warmth spread through her, bringing with it questions about what might be possible when winter finally released its grip on the land and on hearts that had begun to thaw in its deepest cold. February yielded reluctantly to March, the change of months, bringing subtle shifts to the Dakota landscape. The sun lingered longer in the sky, and though bitter cold still dominated most days, occasional afternoons hinted at the distant promise of spring. During these briefer, milder interludes, Running Wolf expanded Sarah's training beyond the immediate vicinity of the tipi, teaching her to recognize landmarks that would guide her safely if they became separated. "Always know your direction," he instructed, as they stood atop a small rise that afforded views across the snow-covered prairie. "Sun rises there," he pointed east. "Sets there," gesturing west. "Stars above hold patterns that never change. Learn to read them, and you will never truly be lost." Sarah absorbed these lessons eagerly, recognizing that he was preparing her for greater independence, though whether for eventual separation or partnership remained unspoken between them. Their relationship had evolved into something neither could have anticipated. Mutual respect had deepened into friendship, and friendship had begun to transform into something more complex that neither had yet acknowledged directly. On a particularly clear morning in mid-March, Running Wolf announced plans for a longer expedition than usual. "We must check the western ridge," he explained as they prepared, "determine if passage toward Fort Pierre is becoming possible. Also, games may be moving as days grow longer. The journey would require most of a day, necessitating careful preparation." Sarah helped pack essential supplies: food, extra layers against changing weather, basic tools, and emergency fire-starting materials. As they worked, she noticed Running Wolf adding items he typically left behind for shorter excursions. His old Army-issue binoculars, a small pouch of trading goods, and most notably, his rifle, meticulously maintained despite its age. "Do you expect trouble?" she asked, nodding toward the weapon. Running Wolf secured the rifle in its protective wrapping. "A wise traveler prepares for what might happen, not only what is expected. The winter has been harsh. Hunger makes both animals and men unpredictable." His caution reminded Sarah that despite their peaceful coexistence in this remote winter camp, the world beyond remained fraught with tensions, between settlers and native peoples, between rival tribes, and sometimes between desperate individuals. Simply struggling to survive, they set out shortly after dawn, snowshoes still necessary for efficient travel, despite slowly compacting drifts. Running Wolf set a measured pace that Sarah could maintain without exhaustion, their breath forming clouds that dissipated in the crisp air. The landscape opened before them as they moved westward, rolling prairie dotted with stands of trees, occasional rocky outcroppings, and frozen streams that would become rushing waterways when the spring thaw finally arrived. Near midday, they reached the ridge Running Wolf had described, a long, sloping elevation that offered expansive views in all directions. To the west, Sarah could make out the distant smudge of what might be smoke from Fort Pierre, though at such distance it was difficult to be certain. South and east stretched the seemingly endless prairie, broken only by watercourses marked by lines of trees following their frozen paths. Running Wolf surveyed the terrain methodically through his binoculars, paying particular attention to areas where game might be found or where travelers might pass. Sarah watched his focused assessment, admiring the calm efficiency that characterized everything he did. "What do you see?" she finally asked, when his survey seemed complete. He lowered the binoculars, expression thoughtful. "Snow begins to compact. On southern slopes, in 2 weeks, perhaps 3, major trails will become passable." He pointed southeast. "That direction, a herd of elk has moved into the valley. Good hunting soon." Then, turning west, his expression shifted subtly. "And there, riders." Sarah followed his gaze, but saw nothing beyond the rolling terrain. "Riders? How many?" 3, too distant to identify. He handed her the binoculars, directing her gaze to a barely perceptible movement along what must be a trail, though it was indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape to her untrained eye. Through the lenses, she eventually located what he had spotted: tiny figures on horseback, moving slowly but steadily in a northerly direction, roughly parallel to the ridge where they stood but still miles distant. Army patrols sometimes travel this season, Running Wolf explained, taking back the binoculars for another look. Or traders seeking early advantage. Sometimes Lakota scouts from other bands. He studied the riders a moment longer. Their path does not threaten our camp. Nevertheless, he seemed troubled by their presence, and they remained on the ridge longer than planned, watching until the distant riders disappeared from view behind a line of hills. During their return journey, running, Wolf maintained a heightened vigilance, occasionally pausing to listen or to study tracks they crossed. His caution communicated itself to Sarah, who found herself scanning their surroundings with new awareness of potential dangers. "You're concerned about those riders," she observed, as they neared their camp late in the afternoon. Running Wolf adjusted his pack before responding. "Winter's end brings movement. Movement brings unexpected meetings. Not all such meetings are friendly." "You think they might be hostile? Toward you or toward any they encounter, perhaps?" He glanced at her. "You have not seen the aftermath, when fear and hatred guide men's actions." The gravity in his voice told Sarah he spoke from personal experience. She had read newspaper accounts of conflicts between settlers and native tribes, but always from the settlers' perspective, with native peoples portrayed as the aggressors. Running Wolf's words hinted at a different reality she had never been allowed to consider. They reached the teepee without incident, but the day's observations had introduced a new element of caution to their previously isolated existence. That evening, as they prepared their meal, Running Wolf made a decision that surprised Sarah. "Tomorrow we begin new lessons," he announced. "You must learn to use this." He indicated his hunting knife, a well-maintained blade with a bone handle worn smooth from years of use. "And to understand the rifle, though I hope you never need it." Sarah's initial reaction was apprehension. She had never handled weapons before. James had owned a rifle but had taken responsibility for hunting and protection himself. The idea of learning such skills both intimidated and, she had to admit, intrigued her. "You think I might need to defend myself," she said. It wasn't a question. Running Wolf nodded, his expression serious. "Knowledge harms no one. Ignorance can be fatal. A wise teacher understands this." His reference to her role as educator, applying her own principles to this unexpected curriculum, subtly eased her discomfort. If she truly believed in the value of knowledge, how could she reject learning skills that might prove essential? The following days introduced Sarah to aspects of frontier survival that her previous life had sheltered her from. Running Wolf proved as patient and thorough in teaching these skills as he had been with all others. He began with the knife, showing her how to hold it properly, how to use it for practical tasks beyond food preparation, and, with clear reluctance but firm resolve, how it could be employed for protection if absolutely necessary. "The knife is a tool first," he emphasized. "It creates before it destroys. Remember this." The rifle lessons were more complicated, not just physically, but emotionally for Sarah. The weapon represented a power she had never wielded, the ability to affect life and death at a distance. Running Wolf sensed her discomfort and addressed it directly. "Among my people, those who hunt take no joy in killing. We thank the animal spirit for the gift of its flesh. Use every part with respect." He showed her how to load the rifle, how to aim properly, how to account for wind and distance. This knowledge does not require use, but not having it removes choice. Sarah gradually overcame her initial reluctance, recognizing the wisdom in his approach. As with everything else he taught, Running Wolf emphasized understanding principles rather than simply memorizing actions, why certain precautions were necessary, how the mechanics of the weapon functioned, when its use would be justified, and when it would not. These lessons continued alongside their regular activities, adding a new dimension to days already filled with practical skills development and their ongoing educational exchange. Sarah's proficiency with written English had helped Running Wolf advance his reading and writing to levels that would serve him well in future dealings with settlers and officials. In turn, his instruction had transformed her from a helpless Easterner into someone who could survive, not yet thrive perhaps, but genuinely survive, in the challenging Dakota environment. Nearly a week after their observation of the distant riders, their relative peace was disrupted. Sarah woke before dawn to find Running Wolf already dressed and alert, his rifle uncovered and close at hand. "What is it?" she asked, immediately sensing his tension. "Horses," he replied quietly. "3 riders approach from the west. They follow our tracks from yesterday's hunting." Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. After weeks of isolation, contact with others should have been welcome news. Instead, it felt like a threat to the world they had created together. "The same riders we saw from the ridge?" Running Wolf moved to the teepee entrance, listening intently. "Perhaps. They will reach our camp soon after sunrise. Prepare yourself, but show no fear. Fear invites aggression." Sarah dressed quickly, her mind racing. If the approaching riders were army personnel, her presence as a white woman in a Lakota winter camp would require explanation. If they were traders or trappers, their reaction to finding her here was unpredictable at best. And if they were Lakota from another band, her presence might create complications for Running Wolf she could only begin to imagine. As the first pale light of dawn filtered through the smoke hole, Running Wolf made a decision. "We will meet them. Outside, not within our shelter. It shows confidence." He handed Sarah his second-best knife, which she secured at her waist as he had taught her. "Follow my lead, speak only when necessary." They positioned themselves near the entrance to the teepee, a small fire burning before them, presenting an image of calm readiness rather than alarm. Running Wolf stood slightly ahead of Sarah, his rifle held casually but accessible, his posture neither threatening nor submissive. The sound of approaching horses became audible, 3 sets of hooves moving at a walk through snow that had hardened enough to support their weight without completely masking the sound of their passage. Minutes later, 3 riders emerged from the tree line that partially sheltered the winter camp. Sarah's first impression was one of mismatched companions. The lead rider was clearly a white man, heavily bearded, wearing a battered army coat. Over civilian clothing, his horse larger than the others and equipped with a standard military saddle. Behind him rode a younger man, also white, thin-faced and weary-eyed. The third rider, slightly separated from the others, was native. Not Lakota, Sarah thought, noting differences in his clothing and appearance from what Running Wolf had described of his people. The lead rider halted at a respectful distance, raising an empty hand in greeting. "Ho, the camp!" he called in a voice roughened by weather and tobacco. His gaze moved from Running Wolf to Sarah, surprise evident in his expression. "Well now, this is unexpected company indeed," Running Wolf responded, with a measured nod, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "You travel early in the season," he observed in English, his tone neutral. The bearded man dismounted, motioning for his companions to remain on horseback. "Winter breaks early this year. We're headed to Fort Pierre before the spring rush." His attention remained fixed on Sarah, curiosity and something less definable in his gaze. "Douglas Carter," he introduced himself, not extending a hand, but offering a slight bow. "My companions are Levi Thornton and Painted Horse." He gestured to the younger white man and the native rider respectively. Sarah noted that the one called Painted Horse showed no reaction to being introduced, his expression as impassive as Running Wolf's. "I'm Sarah Holloway," she responded, deciding directness was preferable to allowing speculation. "Mr. Wolf rescued me during the January blizzards when I became separated from my traveling party." The half-truth seemed safer than explaining her abandonment by Whispering Pines, or her subsequent choice to remain with Running Wolf rather than seek return to white settlement at the first opportunity. Carter's eyebrows rose. Remarkable indeed. Your family must be beside themselves with worry, Mum. We'd be honored to escort you to Fort Pierre when you're ready to travel. The offer, though phrased courteously, carried an assumption Sarah found presumptuous, that she naturally wished to return to white society at the first opportunity, and that Running Wolf's assistance had been merely temporary expediency rather than the beginning of a more complex relationship. Before she could respond, Running Wolf spoke. The trails remain dangerous for inexperienced travelers. When safer passage is possible, Mrs. Holloway will decide her own path. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for his subtle support, affirming her agency without directly challenging Carter's assumptions. Carter studied Running Wolf with new interest. You speak excellent English, friend. Educated at the mission school, were you? I learned in many places, Running Wolf replied evenly. Knowledge has value regardless of its source. A smile spread beneath Carter's beard, though it didn't reach his eyes. Well said. You must be quite the scholar out here in the wilderness. He turned back to Sarah. Though I imagine you've been eager for civilized conversation after months with only, he gestured vaguely toward Running Wolf, limited company. The dismissive implication raised heat in Sarah's cheeks. On the contrary, Mr. Carter, I've found our conversations most edifying. Mr. Wolf's knowledge of this territory, its history, and its natural properties far exceeds anything I learned in Eastern schools. Carter seemed taken aback by her defense, reassessing the situation with narrowed eyes. I see, he said finally. Well, regardless, we'd be pleased to carry any messages to Fort Pierre for you. Perhaps there are people who should know of your situation. The loaded pause made Sarah's skin crawl. Carter clearly found her presence. In a Lakota winter camp, scandalous, her apparent comfort with the arrangement even more so. His offered assistance carried implicit judgment and threat. Running Wolf had evidently reached similar conclusions. We thank you for the offer, he said with formal politeness that created distance rather than connection. Our supplies are sufficient, and we require no assistance at present. Carter glanced between them, something calculating entering his expression. Of course, but since we've happened upon your camp, perhaps you might offer traditional hospitality. Coffee or a meal would be welcome after hard riding. The request placed Running Wolf in a difficult position. Lakota custom dictated generosity toward travelers, yet every instinct warned that allowing these men closer access to their camp and to Sarah would be unwise. We can offer coffee, Running Wolf decided after a moment's consideration. Our supplies allow a little more. He gestured Sarah back toward the teepee with a slight nod, clearly intending her to prepare the coffee while he remained watchful of their visitors. Sarah understood immediately, retreating to the shelter where she could move the small kettle they used for coffee over the internal fire. Through the partly open entrance flap, she could see Running Wolf maintain his position, keeping himself between the visitors and the teepee. Carter dismounted, instructing his companions to remain on horseback. Fine animal you have there, he commented, nodding toward Running Wolf's horse, tethered in a sheltered area nearby. Army issue, if I'm not mistaken. Payment for guiding. Services, Running Wolf replied without elaboration. Inside the teepee, Sarah worked quickly, her hands steady despite her inner turmoil. Something about Carter disturbed her deeply, not merely his obvious prejudice, but a calculating quality beneath his superficial courtesy. As she prepared the coffee using their precious supply of beans, she listened intently to the conversation outside. Do you guide for the army regularly? Carter was asking, his tone falsely casual. When the terms are fair, Running Wolf answered. Useful skills, knowing the territory, especially now with so many changes coming. Carter's voice lowered slightly, though still audible to Sarah. Gold in the Black Hills has folks excited. The army can barely keep settlers from rushing in. Before the treaties are properly adjusted, the emphasis on the last word sent a chill through Sarah. The Black Hills were sacred to the Lakota, protected by treaty from white encroachment. Adjustment could only mean one thing: violation of those guarantees. Running Wolf's response was measured. Treaties signed in good faith should be honored by all parties. Carter laughed, a harsh sound without humor. That's a fine sentiment, friend, truly. But we both know how these things go. Progress can't be stopped by pieces of paper. He lowered his voice further. Smart Indians know which way the wind blows. Position himself accordingly. The attempted manipulation was as transparent as it was offensive. Sarah had heard enough. Gathering the coffee pot and the few cups they possessed, she emerged from the tipi, interrupting whatever response Running Wolf might have made. "Coffee's ready, gentlemen," she announced with forced brightness, taking control of the interaction through the familiar rituals of hospitality she had observed countless times as the wife of a respected craftsman in Whispering Pines. "I'm afraid we have no sugar to offer." Carter accepted a cup with exaggerated courtesy. "Much obliged, Mrs. Holloway. Been a while since I've had coffee served by a lady's hand." Sarah smiled tightly, serving Running Wolf next, before offering cups to the other two men, who had finally dismounted but remained close to their horses. The young white man, Thornton, accepted with a mumbled thanks, avoiding eye contact. Painted Horse declined with a slight shake of his head, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance. As they drank the coffee, Carter resumed conversation, now directing his attention primarily to Sarah. "You mentioned being separated from your traveling party, ma'am. Might I ask where you were bound?" "Hope's Crossing," Sarah replied, sticking to her earlier narrative. "My late husband's cousin has a property there." The fabricated destination seemed safer than admitting her desperate flight from Whispering Pines. "Late husband?" Carter's expression shifted to practiced sympathy. "My condolences, ma'am." "Recently widowed, then?" "Last autumn," Sarah answered, keeping her responses brief to discourage further personal inquiries. "Such a tragedy, and now this ordeal." Carter shook his head. "Providence works in mysterious ways, though, bringing you to safe harbor." His gaze flicked to Running Wolf and back to Sarah. Temporary safe harbor, of course. The implication was clear. Carter considered her current arrangement both inappropriate and necessarily short-term. Sarah felt Running Wolf tense beside her, though his expression remained impassive. "Providence indeed, Mr. Carter," she agreed pleasantly. "I've found exactly the guidance I needed during this difficult time." Carter studied her over the rim of his cup, reassessing. Sarah could almost see him adjusting his approach, as he realized she might not be the distressed damsel eager for rescue that he had initially assumed. "Well," he said finally, draining the last of his coffee, "we should be on our way if we hope to make decent progress before sunset." He returned the cup to Sarah with a nod. "Much obliged for the hospitality." As the men prepared to depart, Carter turned to Running Wolf with a parting observation that carried a thinly veiled warning. "The army's been having trouble with renegade Sioux harassing settlements south of Fort Pierre. Been authorized to deal with any suspicious activity rather firmly. Might want to keep that in mind if you're traveling in the coming weeks." Running. Wolf nodded once, acknowledging the information without comment. His stillness, Sarah had learned, often masked his most intense reactions. The three riders mounted their horses, Carter tipping his hat to Sarah with exaggerated courtesy. "Ma'am, should you decide you're ready for more civilized accommodations, we'll be at Fort Pierre for at least 2 weeks before heading east. Happy to escort you to Hope's Crossing or wherever else you might wish to go." "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Carter," Sarah replied with matching formality. "Safe travels." They watched in silence as the riders departed, following the trail that led westward toward Fort Pierre. Only when they had disappeared from sight did Running Wolf's posture relax slightly, though concern remained evident in his features. "What do you make of them?" Sarah asked once they had retreated inside the tipi. Running Wolf secured the entrance flap before responding. "The bearded one, Carter. He speaks with many tongues. One for you, one for me, another for what he truly thinks." He added wood to the central fire, his movements deliberate. "The young one fears his own shadow. The third, painted horse, is Crow, not Lakota. Traditional enemies, though such distinctions matter less now with all tribes facing the same threats." Carter's remarks about the Black Hills troubled me, Sarah admitted. "And his warning about the army dealing with suspicious activity—" "Not a warning," Running Wolf corrected. "A threat. He disapproves of what he found here." His gaze met hers directly. "A white woman living willingly with a Lakota man violates boundaries he holds sacred." The blunt assessment hung between them, explicitly acknowledging what they had both understood but rarely verbalized, that their growing connection transcended mere survival cooperation, becoming something neither Carter nor most of white society would sanction. "Will they cause problems?" Sarah asked. Running Wolf considered the question carefully. "Carter is a man who sees opportunity in everything. If reporting your presence here benefits him, he will do so without hesitation." "Then perhaps I should go to Fort Pierre," Sarah suggested reluctantly. "Establish my own narrative before he can create one that damages us both." "Perhaps," Running Wolf acknowledged, "but not yet, and not alone. Carter's words about renegade. Sioux may be true or false. Either way, the threat is real. Army patrols will be watching for any native travelers, especially those accompanied by whites." The implications were clear. Travel now would be dangerous for both of them, albeit for different reasons. Running Wolf would be vulnerable to suspicious army patrols. Sarah would be subject to judgment and potentially forced rescue if found in his company. "What do you suggest?" she asked, trusting his assessment of their situation. "We wait, watch, prepare." He checked the securing of the entrance flap again, a small gesture that revealed his heightened vigilance. "Carter travels to Fort Pierre, not away from it. If he speaks of finding you here, it will be to army officers who cannot leave their posts without orders. Such orders take time." Sarah nodded, seeing the logic in his analysis. "So we have time to consider our options." "Yes." Running Wolf's expression softened slightly. "And you have time to decide which world you wish to return to, if either." The quiet statement acknowledged the choice that had been forming in Sarah's mind since long before Carter's unwelcome appearance. Whether to return to white society with its comforts and constraints, remain in some capacity among the Lakota, despite the challenges such a choice would entail, or perhaps forge a path that somehow incorporated elements of both worlds. That evening, as they prepared for sleep, the usual comfortable silence between them had been replaced by a watchful tension. Running Wolf checked his rifle one final time before setting it within easy reach, a precaution he hadn't taken since the worst of the winter storms. "You don't trust them to simply continue to Fort Pierre," Sarah observed. "I trust what I have, seen and known, not what strangers claim." He arranged his sleeping furs nearer to the entrance than usual. Carter's eyes showed interest beyond simple curiosity. The Crow warrior watched too carefully. Only the young one seemed as he appeared, nervous and out of place. The assessment matched Sarah's own impressions, though she lacked Running Wolf's experience in reading potential threats. As she settled onto her sleeping platform, exhaustion competed with anxiety, making rest elusive despite the physical demands of the day. "Sleep," Running Wolf encouraged, noting her restlessness. "I will keep watch first. We will take turns through the night." The simple "we" carried more comfort than any elaborate reassurance could have provided. Whatever threat Carter and his Companions might represent they would face it together, not as rescuer and rescued, but as partners who had chosen each other's company when all external pressures would have separated them. Sarah closed her eyes, finding unexpected calm in that knowledge. The world beyond their small shelter might judge, threaten, or attempt to sever the connection they had formed, but it could not erase what had grown between them during the winter's enforced intimacy, trust that transcended cultural differences, respect that defied social expectations, and something deeper that neither had yet fully named, but both increasingly acknowledged. In the final moments before sleep claimed her, Sarah realized with perfect clarity that regardless of Carter's intentions, or the complications his discovery might create, she had already made her choice about which world she wished to inhabit. It was neither the restrictive society she had left behind, nor a complete abandonment of her own cultural identity, but something new, a life built at the intersection of two worlds, with a man whose quiet strength and profound wisdom had transformed her understanding of what truly mattered. The challenge now would be defending that choice against those who would deny her right to make it. A battle that had just begun with Carter's unwelcome appearance and would likely intensify in the coming days as winter's grip on the Dakota plains finally began to loosen. The day after Carter's visit dawned clear but tense, with both Sarah and Running Wolf moving through their morning routines with heightened vigilance. Sleep had come in shifts through the night, neither willing to leave them completely vulnerable, despite Running Wolf's assessment that immediate danger was unlikely. Now, as pale sunlight filtered through the smoke hole of the teepee, they faced the practical implications of having been discovered. "We should prepare for a swift departure if necessary," Running Wolf announced as they finished a simple breakfast. "What cannot be carried must be hidden or abandoned." Sarah nodded, surveying their small shared world with new eyes. The winter months had accumulated more possessions than she'd realized. Tools she'd learned to use, clothing adapted to the harsh climate, the small but precious educational materials they'd employed in their knowledge exchange. Each item now required evaluation through the harsh lens of potential flight. "How soon might we need to leave?" she asked, already mentally categorizing their belongings into essentials and expendables. Running Wolf considered his expression typically measured despite the circumstances. "Not immediately. Carter reaches Fort Pierre today or tomorrow. If he reports our presence to authorities, they will not act without deliberation. Army commanders dislike unnecessary movement of troops, especially as spring thaw approaches. But they will come eventually," Sarah concluded. "Perhaps." He began gathering his most essential hunting and survival tools. "Or perhaps Carter's interest lies elsewhere. His words about the Black Hills suggest a man seeking opportunity, not justice." Sarah recalled Carter's thinly veiled references to gold and treaty adjustments with growing unease. "You think he might be prospecting illegally? In Lakota territory?" Men like Carter walk where profit leads, regardless of boundaries or laws. Running Wolf secured his knife at his belt with practiced efficiency. "Today, we will scout southward. If others like him travel these lands, we should know their numbers and directions." The decision to actively gather information rather than simply prepare for retreat surprised Sarah, though in retrospect it aligned with everything she had learned about Running Wolf's methodical approach to challenges. Knowledge precedes action in all things. They departed within the hour, the teepee secured against both weather and potential intruders, essential emergency supplies cached in locations only. They knew Sarah had become proficient enough with snowshoes that she maintained a reasonable pace alongside Running Wolf, though his natural efficiency of movement still far exceeded her recently acquired skill. Rather than taking a direct route southward, Running Wolf led them along a circuitous path that utilized natural features, ridgelines, frozen streams, and stands of trees, to minimize their visibility while maximizing their range of vision. By midday, they had reached a vantage point that offered views across miles of snow-covered prairie. There, Running Wolf indicated, handing Sarah the binoculars and directing her gaze toward a distant smudge of movement. More travelers, 6, perhaps 7. Through the lenses, Sarah could make out a small party moving slowly northward, though at this distance details remained indistinct. Not military, she observed. The formation is too irregular. Running Wolf nodded approvingly at her observation. Prospectors most likely, or traders hoping to circumvent Fort Pierre's oversight. They continued their surveillance, identifying 2 more small groups traveling through the territory before beginning their return journey. As they moved, running, Wolf pointed out tracks they crossed, some from game animals, others clearly human. More traffic than usual for this season, he noted with concern. Word spreads about the Black Hills, like insects to honey. They come. Will your people resist? Sarah asked, already knowing the answer but wanting to understand the full implications. Running. Wolf's expression darkened. The Black Hills are sacred land. Pahasapa holds the heart of Lakota spirituality. We have already surrendered much territory in previous treaties. Thus, many bands will not yield without bloodshed. The gravity of his words hung between them as they continued homeward. Sarah had read newspaper accounts of Indian troubles throughout her life, but always from the perspective that portrayed native resistance as irrational obstruction of inevitable progress. Now, walking beside a man whose people faced existential threat from her own culture's expansion, those simplistic narratives crumbled under the weight of human reality. "And you?" she asked quietly. "Where will you stand if conflict comes?" Running Wolf was silent for several paces before responding. "I have walked between worlds long enough to know neither side holds complete truth or virtue. But when ancestral lands are threatened, when promises are broken for greed—" He met her gaze directly. "Some choices cannot be avoided." The answer held both clarity and complication. Sarah understood that Running Wolf's position as a cultural intermediary would become increasingly untenable if tensions escalated into open conflict. The bridge he had carefully built between worlds might collapse entirely, forcing him to choices he had long sought to avoid. They reached their winter camp by late afternoon, confirming that no one had approached it during their absence. As they restored order to the teepee and prepared the evening meal, a contemplative silence settled between them, each absorbed in private thoughts about implications of what they had observed. Finally, as they sat beside the central fire, sharing a simple supper of dried meat and preserved berries, Sarah broke the silence. "Carter's visit and what we saw today, it changes everything, doesn't it?" Running Wolf studied the flames before answering. "The world beyond our winter shelter always existed. Now it simply announces itself more loudly." "That's not quite what I meant," Sarah persisted. "I mean for us, for whatever this has become." She gestured between them, acknowledging the undefined but undeniable connection that had developed during their shared isolation. Understanding softened Running Wolf's features. "Among my people, winter is a time of stories, of reflection, of deepening understanding. Spring brings action, decision, movement." He set aside his empty bowl, choosing his next words with characteristic care. "What has grown between us during winter now faces spring's test." The poetic framing carried profound truth. Their relationship had developed in extraordinary circumstances, isolated from external pressures, focused on immediate survival needs, and gradually evolving into deeper connection through shared knowledge and mutual respect. Now external reality intruded, demanding that this fragile new bond define itself against powerful social forces that would deny its legitimacy. "When I left Whispering Pines," Sarah said softly. I was seeking physical survival. I never imagined finding... She hesitated, struggling to articulate the complex transformation these months had wrought. Finding myself again, finding purpose, finding... Her eyes met his. Finding connection, I thought died with James. Running Wolf's steady gaze held neither demand nor expectation, only patient acceptance of whatever truth she needed to express. This quality, this profound respect for her autonomy of thought and feeling, had been foundational to the trust between them from the beginning. The path forward is not simple, he acknowledged. A white woman who chooses to walk alongside a Lakota man walks against the current of both rivers. Many on both shores will disapprove. I'm familiar with disapproval, Sarah replied, with unexpected lightness. Educating women beyond basic literacy was considered a dangerous innovation when I attended Oberlin. Teaching frontier children about world geography rather than just practical arithmetic scandalized half the mothers in Whispering Pines. A rare smile briefly transformed Running Wolf's serious features. You have practiced defying expectations. Yes, Sarah agreed, her own smile fading to solemnity. But I recognize the difference in magnitude. Academic controversies don't compare to the boundaries we'd be challenging. The frank acknowledgement hung between them, neither minimizing the obstacles nor allowing them final authority over personal choice. For several moments they sat in silence, the fire crackling between them, each contemplating implications of the unspoken question at the heart of their conversation. What happens when winter ends? Finally, Running Wolf spoke. Tomorrow we will. Prepare more thoroughly. The teepee must be ready for swift departure or determined defense, whichever becomes necessary. His practical focus returned, though his eyes held new warmth when they met hers. Tonight, rest. Decisions that must be made will become clearer with morning light. That night, as Sarah lay beneath fur blankets, listening to the familiar sounds of their shelter, the gentle pop of the banked fire, the occasional shift of the teepee covering in response to wind, Running Wolf's steady breathing from his sleeping place near the entrance, she realized how completely this temporary refuge had become home. Not because of physical comfort or material security, but because it was where she had rediscovered purpose, dignity, and the possibility of genuine partnership based on mutual respect rather than societal expectation. Whatever challenges the encroaching outside world might bring, whatever difficult choices awaited, she would face them from a position of newfound strength, not as the abandoned widow desperate for protection, but as a woman who had found her own capacity for resilience and adaptation. Morning arrived with unexpected drama, not from human intruders but from nature itself. Sarah woke to the sound of water dripping steadily through the smoke hole, a rhythmic pattern that signaled significant change. Running Wolf was already up, rearranging items within the teepee to protect them from the moisture. The thaw begins, he announced, noticing her wakefulness. Earlier than expected, the south-facing snow melts rapidly. Sarah rose quickly, helping to reorganize their belongings. Through the partially open entrance flap, she could see that the landscape had transformed overnight. What had been pristine white now showed patches of exposed earth where the strengthening March sun had finally overcome winter's grip. Water trickled in small rivulets down natural drainage pathways, and from the shelter's roof, accumulated snow slid in occasional wet clumps. "Is this normal?" she asked, securing their precious paper items, the journal, Robinson Crusoe, and the notes from their lessons, in the oilskin wrapping that protected them from moisture. "Spring comes suddenly some years," Running Wolf replied, his tone suggesting, "This particular thaw was unusually abrupt. The creek will rise by midday. We must move essentials to higher ground." The warning proved prescient. By noon, the slow trickle of melting snow had become a steady flow as warming temperatures accelerated. The process. What had been a barely discernible depression marking the nearby creek was now visible as a swelling watercourse that threatened to overflow its banks. They worked steadily through the day, relocating critical supplies to the slight rise where the teepee stood and reinforcing its foundation against potential flooding. The physical labor was demanding but familiar after months of shared survival work. What differed was the urgency. Nature's timetable had suddenly accelerated, compressing decisions they had expected to face over weeks into potential days. "How quickly will the main trails become passable?" Sarah asked as they paused briefly for a late afternoon meal. Running Wolf surveyed the rapidly changing landscape. "For single riders, perhaps 5 days if this warmth continues. For wagons, longer." He met her questioning gaze directly. "And for those seeking us specifically, determination may overcome difficult conditions." The implication was clear. Their time of relative isolation was ending more rapidly than anticipated. Sarah felt simultaneous relief and apprehension. The thaw meant an end to winter's deadly grip, expanded mobility, and renewed access to resources. It also meant confronting the social realities they had temporarily escaped. As dusk approached, they completed their preparations against potential flooding and returned to the teepee, both physically exhausted but mentally alert to the changing circumstances. The evening meal was simple but sustaining, the last of their preserved venison, supplemented with dried berries and spring roots Running Wolf had identified emerging from the newly exposed soil. "The sudden thaw changes our planning," Running Wolf observed as they finished eating. "We must decide the direction sooner than expected." Sarah nodded, understanding the multivalent meaning of direction, not merely physical travel, but life pathway. "What options do you see before us?" Running Wolf considered carefully before answering, his respect for the weight of this conversation evident in his measured response. "Several paths are possible, each with different consequences." He outlined them methodically. "You could return to White Settlement, Fort Pierre initially, then perhaps eastward to more established towns. Your education would have value in such places, especially for a woman willing to teach frontier children." This option, the one most aligned with societal expectations, now seemed foreign to Sarah, a retreat to a world whose values she had increasingly questioned during her time with Running Wolf. "Alternatively," he continued, "you might join the Lakota temporarily, not as one of us, but as a teacher for those children whose parents wish them to learn English and white ways. Some bands camp near Fort Pierre in spring, trading and meeting with officials. Such an arrangement would be unusual, but not unprecedented." Sarah could envision this possibility more clearly, a role that utilized her skills while allowing her to maintain connection with the world she had discovered through Running Wolf, yet still acknowledge the reality of her different cultural background. "And the third option?" she prompted, sensing he had left something unspoken. Running Wolf met her gaze directly. "We continue together, neither fully in White World nor fully in the Lakota world, but creating our own path between. Some places exist where such arrangements, while not common, can survive. Trading posts, mission settlements, smaller agencies where practical skills matter more than rigid boundaries. This third possibility, the one that most acknowledged the personal bond that had formed between them, was both the most appealing and the most challenging. It required rejecting fundamental societal structures from both cultures, relying instead on the strength of what they had built together during the winter's isolation. "And what do you want, Running Wolf?" Sarah asked, realizing he had presented options without revealing his own preference. The question seemed to catch him momentarily, off guard, perhaps because few in his experience had prioritized his desires over practicalities. After a thoughtful pause, he responded with uncharacteristic directness. I have walked alone between worlds for many years, belonging fully to neither. In you, I found someone who sees value in both worlds without being enslaved to either. His voice, typically measured and pragmatic, carried subtle but unmistakable emotion. I would continue walking this path together, if that is also your choice. The simple declaration, devoid of flowery sentiment but profound in its sincerity, moved Sarah deeply. In her previous life, she had experienced James's more conventionally expressed devotion, shaped by the romantic traditions of their shared culture. Running Wolf's statement carried different power, the straightforward truth of a man whose every word was carefully considered. Since James died, Sarah began, organizing her thoughts as she spoke. I've existed in a strange halfway state, physically alive but without purpose or connection. Whispering Pines saw only what I had lost, not what remained. She met his steady gaze. You saw me differently from the beginning, not as a helpless burden, but as someone with value to contribute, with capacity to learn and grow beyond established boundaries. Running Wolf listened attentively, his expression revealing nothing of how her words affected him. This, too, had become precious to Sarah, his ability to hear without immediately imposing his own reaction, creating space for her thoughts to fully develop. The world will not make this choice easy, she acknowledged, but I've already faced abandonment, near death, and rediscovery of purpose. What remains to fear except returning to a half-life defined by others' limitations? The question hung between them, rhetorical yet profound in its implications. Sarah took a steadying breath before continuing. I choose the third path, together, creating something that perhaps neither of our worlds fully recognizes, but that contains truth from both. She held his gaze steadily. If that remains your choice as well. For a moment, Running Wolf's customary stoicism gave way to visible emotion, not dramatic by white cultural standards, but in the subtle language of expression she had learned to read during their months together, profoundly significant. He reached across the space between them, offering his hand palm upward, not demanding but inviting connection. Sarah placed her hand in his, the simple contact symbolizing commitment more meaningful than elaborate declarations. His fingers closed gently around hers, the calluses earned through survival work, meeting similar hardened spots on her once soft teacher's hands. Together then, he said simply, whatever storms come. The decision, once articulated, created its own strange peace, despite the uncertainties that still awaited them. They spent the evening planning more concretely, weighing options for their departure from the winter camp that had sheltered their transformation from strangers to partners. Fort Pierre would be their initial destination, unavoidable as the primary trading post and administrative center for the region. There they would assess conditions, gather information about both white settlement patterns and Lakota band movements, and determine their next steps based on where opportunity and safety might best align. Some traders at the fort maintain relations with both worlds, Running Wolf explained. James Mackenzie, a Scotsman who married a Lakota woman 20 years ago. Thomas Williamson, who runs the small mission school but respects native ways more than most Christians. Such people might provide guidance or temporary shelter. Sarah absorbed these details, recognizing that Running Wolf had maintained more awareness of the outside world than his isolated winter camp might suggest. His survival had always depended on understanding both cultures and the individuals who navigated between them. As they prepared for sleep on this night of decision, the sound of rushing water provided a constant reminder of nature's transformative power. The melting snow that had defined their shared landscape for months was returning to fluid form, creating new pathways across terrain that had seemed immutable. The land itself teaches adaptation, Running Wolf observed, noting Sarah's attention to the sounds outside. What appears solid and unchanging, these snow-covered plains, transforms when seasons shift. Yet beneath changing surfaces, the essential, earth remains. The observation carried obvious metaphorical weight. Their circumstances would change dramatically in coming days as winter's isolation ended, yet the foundation they had built, through mutual respect and shared knowledge, would remain if they chose to maintain it. Sarah settled into her sleeping, hers with surprising contentment despite the uncertainties ahead. She had made more difficult journeys with far less clarity of purpose. The desperate flight from Whispering Pines had been literally blind, guided only by fear and dwindling hope. This new journey, whatever its challenges, would be undertaken with open eyes, deliberate choice, and partnership that transcended conventional understanding. As sleep approached, Sarah found herself recalling a poem she had taught her students in Whispering Pines, Emerson's thoughts on self-reliance and the courage to follow one's own path despite societal pressure. At the time, she had presented it as abstract philosophy. Now, on the edge of a life decision that defied conventional boundaries, she recognized it as practical wisdom. To believe your own thoughts, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius. Morning arrived with accelerated reminders of nature's transformative power. The creek had risen further overnight, now flowing vigorously where days before only a snow-filled depression had been visible. Birds unseen during winter months had suddenly appeared, their calls adding new dimensions to the awakening landscape. Even the air felt different, heavy with moisture and the earthy sense of thawing soil. Running Wolf emerged from checking conditions outside, his expression confirming Sarah's sense that circumstances were changing more rapidly than anticipated. The main trail to Fort Pierre shows signs of recent travel, he reported. Multiple riders heading east from the fort. The thaw progresses faster than normal. Carter's companions returning with others, Sarah suggested, immediately alert to potential threat. Perhaps. The patterns suggest urgency. Horses pushed harder than wise on soft ground. He began gathering essential travel items with methodical efficiency. We should depart tomorrow at dawn. Today, final preparations. The decision accelerated their careful planning into immediate action. They spent the morning organizing what would be carried with them, what could be cached for potential future retrieval, and what must regretfully be abandoned. The educational materials presented a particular challenge. The books and journal were precious, but vulnerable to weather if inadequately protected during travel. We'll create a special carrier, Sarah decided, demonstrating techniques she had learned from Running Wolf for waterproofing using available materials. Together, they fashioned a protective case from tanned hide, sealed with pine resin and secured with sinew thread. By midday, the practical work was well advanced, allowing them to address less tangible preparations. Running Wolf suggested Sarah practice once more with both knife and rifle, refreshing the defensive skills she had developed under his tutelage. I pray you never need these abilities, he explained as they concluded the brief review session. But knowledge provides choices that ignorance cannot. Sarah nodded, acknowledging both the practicality and the underlying philosophy that had characterized so much of their relationship. Each skill Running Wolf had taught her, from firemaking to weather prediction to self-defense, expanded her capacity for independent decision-making rather than fostering dependence on his protection. The afternoon brought unexpected developments that confirmed the wisdom of their accelerated departure plans. While securing additional resources from a storage cache approximately half a mile from their camp, they encountered fresh tracks that Running Wolf identified immediately as concerning. 4 riders, he noted, crouching to examine the impressions. In the rapidly softening ground. Passed here no more than 2 hours ago. They follow the creek directly toward our camp. Sarah felt adrenaline surge through her system. Carter returning with reinforcements? Possibly. Running Wolf rose, his expression grim. These tracks show military horseshoes, army mounts, not civilians. The implication was clear and alarming. If Carter had indeed reported their situation to authorities at Fort Pierre, official intervention had been dispatched more quickly than they had anticipated. Whatever the official justification, rescuing a white woman from presumed captivity, investigating suspicious activity in treaty territory, or simply asserting authority, the arrival of military personnel dramatically altered their circumstances. "We need to return immediately," Sarah urged, already turning toward their camp. Running Wolf caught her arm gently. "Not directly. We circle wide, approach from behind, observe before revealing ourselves." His caution was well-founded. They took a circuitous route back to the vicinity of their winter shelter, using natural features for concealment as they approached. From a sheltered position on higher ground, they could observe the teepee and its immediate surroundings without being immediately visible to anyone nearby. What they saw confirmed their concerns. 4 horses were indeed tethered near their camp, their riders evidently inside or exploring the immediate vicinity. As they watched, a uniformed figure emerged from the teepee entrance, gesturing to companions still inside. "Army Lieutenant." "Running," Wolf murmured, recognizing the insignia even at this distance, with 3 enlisted men, most likely. "What are our options?" Sarah asked quietly, trying to project calm despite her racing pulse. Running Wolf assessed the situation with practiced efficiency. "They search but have not destroyed. This suggests investigation rather than punishment expedition." He considered for a moment longer before continuing. "They expect to find you, perhaps me as well. Surprise serves no purpose now." "You mean we should simply approach openly?" The suggestion seemed counterintuitive given the potential threat these armed men represented. "With caution," Running Wolf clarified. "You first, where they can clearly see you are unharmed and moving freely. I follow at a slight distance, hands visible, no weapons drawn." The strategy balanced pragmatism with dignity, neither fleeing, like fugitives, nor surrendering control of the narrative by being discovered in hiding. It would allow Sarah to immediately counter any assumption that she required rescue, while demonstrating that Running Wolf posed no threat requiring preemptive violence. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself for what promised to be a pivotal encounter. "I'm ready." The decision made, they moved quickly to implement it, not directly confrontational, but clearly intentional in their approach. As they emerged from concealment and began walking toward the camp, the lieutenant noticed their approach immediately, alerting his men with sharp gestures that brought them to heightened readiness without explicitly drawing weapons. Sarah walked with deliberate confidence, keeping her gaze fixed on the officer rather than his subordinates. Running Wolf followed several paces behind, his posture non-threatening but proud, present as partner rather than captor or suppliant. As they drew closer, Sarah could read surprise in the lieutenant's expression, perhaps at her clearly voluntary approach, or at her appearance, which after months in Lakota winter conditions bore little resemblance to conventional white womanhood of the era. "Ma'am," the officer called when they were within comfortable speaking distance, "are you Sarah Holloway?" The use of her name confirmed Carter's involvement. Sarah continued her steady approach before responding with calm authority that belied her inner tension. "I am, and you are currently trespassing on our winter shelter, Lieutenant. I'd appreciate knowing under what authority you've entered our home without permission." The lieutenant's expression shifted from alert readiness to momentary confusion. At Sarah's assertive greeting, clearly he had expected to find either a woman in distress or no one at all, not a composed, articulate figure confidently challenging his presence. "Lieutenant Michael Foster, ma'am, Dakota Territory Militia acting under Army authority." He straightened slightly, recovering his official bearing. "We received reports of a white woman potentially being held against her will in Lakota Territory. Given the current tensions, the commander at Fort Pierre considered investigation necessary. As you can see, Lieutenant Foster, I am neither being held nor in distress," Sarah replied evenly, continuing her approach until she stood a respectful but self-assured distance from the officer. "I was rescued from certain death during the January blizzards by Mr. Wolf and have been recovering under his protection until travel became possible." Foster's gaze shifted to Running Wolf, who had maintained his position several paces behind Sarah, his demeanor calm but vigilant. "And you would be the gentleman who provided this assistance?" "I'm called Running Wolf among my people," he responded with quiet dignity. "The winter was severe. No human being should face it alone." The lieutenant seemed to assess them both carefully, clearly comparing the scene before him with whatever narrative Carter had provided. "Your situation has caused some concern at Fort Pierre, Mrs. Holloway. Mr. Carter reported finding you in concerning circumstances." "Mr. Carter," Sarah observed dryly, "spent approximately 15 minutes at our camp, accepted our hospitality, and departed with significant misunderstandings about my circumstances." She gestured toward the teepee. "Perhaps we might continue this conversation with more comfort? The afternoon grows cold, and I imagine your men would appreciate a brief rest." The small social nicety, offering hospitality rather than confrontation, visibly eased some tension. Foster nodded, though his men remained alert as they all moved toward the teepee entrance. Sarah entered first, with Running Wolf following and positioning himself near the entrance while Foster and one of his men, a sergeant, joined them inside. The other two soldiers remained outside, ostensibly to watch the horses but clearly also maintaining security. Inside the teepee, the central fire provided both warmth and light as the four settled into an improvised meeting. Sarah noticed Foster taking in the details of their winter home, the organized storage, the evidence of shared living, the carefully maintained condition of everything despite primitive circumstances. "Mr. Carter suggested you were being prevented from returning to civilization, Mrs. Holloway," Foster said finally, addressing Sarah directly. "Mr. Carter assumed much based on limited understanding," Sarah replied calmly. "I was abandoned by my former community in Whispering Pines after my husband's death made me an inconvenient responsibility. When winter storms prevented reaching Hope's Crossing, Mr. Wolf saved my life and provided shelter until safe travel became possible." She met Foster's evaluating gaze directly, which, as the current thought indicates, is only now becoming feasible. Foster glanced toward Running Wolf, whose composed silence neither confirmed nor denied Sarah's account. "You speak excellent English," the lieutenant observed, seemingly reassessing his preconceptions. "I was educated at the mission school," Running Wolf replied evenly. "I have served as guide and translator for army expeditions when the terms were fair." This information clearly registered with Foster, who nodded thoughtfully. That explains certain inconsistencies in Carter's report. He described finding a helpless white woman in the clutches of a savage, which, he gestured vaguely at the evident order and comfort of their arrangements, seems rather exaggerated in retrospect. "Mr. Carter saw what his prejudices prepared him to see," Sarah stated firmly, "not the reality of our situation." A tense silence followed, broken eventually by the sergeant clearing his throat awkwardly. Foster seemed to reach some internal decision, his posture shifting subtly from investigative to conciliatory. "Mrs. Holloway, regardless of the circumstances that brought you here, my orders are to escort you to Fort Pierre, where arrangements can be made for your return to proper society." He spoke with practiced diplomacy. "I'm sure you understand that a white woman living alone with a native man, regardless of the necessity that created the arrangement, cannot continue indefinitely." Sarah had anticipated this response, understanding that Foster operated within constraints of authority and cultural expectations that would not easily bend to individual circumstances. Before she could formulate a measured reply, Running Wolf spoke. "We had already decided to journey to Fort Pierre tomorrow," he stated matter-of-factly. "The thaw makes travel possible, and we have prepared accordingly." Foster's surprise was evident. "We?" "Yes, Lieutenant," Sarah confirmed. My association with Mr. Wolf was initially one of necessity, but over these months it has become one of mutual respect and shared purpose." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I will accompany you to Fort Pierre, but not as someone being rescued from a situation I freely chose to maintain once survival was assured." The lieutenant's expression revealed his struggle to reconcile the reality before him with his preconceptions and orders. "And what exactly do you envision happening at Fort Pierre, Mrs. Holloway? Surely you understand that certain arrangements may be acceptable in wilderness survival situations, but cannot continue in civilized society." The condescension in his tone sparked a flare of indignation in Sarah, but she controlled it, recognizing that confrontation would only harden his position. Instead, she employed the skills that had made her an effective teacher, presenting challenging ideas in ways that made them seem reasonable evolutionary steps rather than radical departures. "Lieutenant Foster, I was an educated teacher before. Winter circumstances brought me here. That hasn't changed. There is a tremendous need for education in these territories, not just for settler children, but for native youth who must navigate an increasingly complex world where cultures interact daily." Foster frowned slightly. "You propose to teach Indian children?" "I propose to use my God-given skills where they are most needed," Sarah corrected gently. "Whether that's in a traditional schoolhouse, a mission settlement, or another arrangement, where knowledge can bridge understanding between our peoples." Running Wolf added his perspective, addressing Foster with the diplomatic experience gained from years of cultural mediation. "Lieutenant, the treaties your government signs with our leaders contain promises of education for Lakota children. Yet qualified teachers who understand both cultures are rare. Mrs. Holloway has learned our ways while sharing her knowledge. Such bridges benefit everyone as changes come to these lands." The practical framing, positioning their unusual partnership as a potential solution to a recognized problem rather than a problematic defiance of convention, seemed to register with Foster. Sarah could almost see him recalculating his approach, weighing official expectations against the unexpected reality he had encountered. "I must still escort you to Fort Pierre," he said finally. "My orders are clear on that point, but I will include your full explanation in my report, rather than simply adopting Carter's interpretation." He glanced between them. "Beyond that, decisions about your future arrangements will involve higher authorities than myself." It was a diplomatic compromise, fulfilling his orders while acknowledging that the situation was more complex than initially presented. Sarah nodded acceptance, recognizing that this first official encounter had gone better than they might reasonably have expected. "We'll depart at dawn," Running Wolf stated. "Our preparations are nearly complete." Foster stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "My men and I will camp nearby and provide escort. Given current tensions with renegade bands, additional protection on the journey is warranted." The phrasing offered both practical security and maintained the fiction that their accompaniment to Fort Pierre was protective rather than custodial, a distinction Sarah appreciated even while recognizing its partial truth. Running Wolf nodded. Agreement, his expression revealing nothing of his private thoughts about this development. After Foster and his sergeant had exited the teepee to rejoin their men and establish their nearby camp, Sarah and Running Wolf exchanged a significant glance. This unexpected acceleration of their timetable created both challenges and opportunities. The army escort would provide security against potential hostile encounters during travel, yet also constrained their independence and emphasized the official scrutiny their unusual relationship would face. "He seems reasonable for a military man," Sarah observed quietly once they were alone. Running Wolf added wood to the central fire before responding. "Foster has served in these territories long enough to understand nuance. Not all officers do." He paused, considering. "This may work in our favor if he reports honestly rather than simply confirming what his superiors expect to hear." They spent the remaining daylight hours completing preparations for departure, now with the added knowledge that they would travel under observation. Sarah carefully packed the educational materials and personal items she considered essential while running. Wolf made final arrangements for the camp's closure, determining what to carry, what to cache for potential future retrieval, and what must be abandoned. As dusk approached, they shared a simple meal that carried emotional significance beyond its practical nourishment, likely their final evening in the shelter that had witnessed the remarkable transformation from strangers to partners. Neither mentioned this directly, but Sarah found herself touching objects with lingering awareness of their shared history. The wooden bowls they had used for countless meals, the sleeping furs that had protected them through bitter cold, the central fire that had provided not just warmth, but the gathering point for their exchange of knowledge and growing understanding. "Tomorrow begins a different journey," Running Wolf observed as they prepared for sleep. "One with a less certain path." Sarah nodded, understanding the multiple layers of his meaning. "The physical route may be clearer, but the way forward for us becomes more complicated. At Fort Pierre, many will see only what they expect to see," he continued. "A white woman who must be returned to her proper place. A Lakota man who stepped beyond acceptable boundaries." "And what do you see?" Sarah asked quietly. Running Wolf's expression softened in the firelight. "Two people who discovered an unexpected truth together. Whether others accept this truth matters less than our commitment to honor it." The simple statement carried profound significance, an affirmation that whatever external judgments they might face, the connection they had formed remained valid and worthy of protection. Sarah reached across the space between them, taking his hand in a gesture that had become meaningful through its rarity. Unlike the demonstrative physical affection common in white society, their connection had developed primarily through shared experience and mutual respect, making these moments of contact particularly significant. "Whatever happens at Fort Pierre," she promised, "I won't allow others to redefine what we've built here." Running Wolf's fingers closed around hers with gentle strength. "Some paths disappear under winter snow, only to emerge stronger when thaw comes. Our path will find its way." They slept that night with the knowledge that dawn would bring profound change, not just in physical location, but in the social reality they would navigate together. The winter's isolation had provided rare freedom to develop connections based on authentic exchange rather than societal expectation. That protected space was ending, but the foundation it had built remained. Morning arrived with a clarity that seemed fitting for significant transition, the sun rising into a cloudless sky, illuminating a landscape transformed by the accelerating thaw. What had been pristine white expanse now showed increasing patches of exposed earth, and the sound of running water provided a constant reminder of nature's unstoppable cycles. Lieutenant Foster and his men were already preparing their horses when Sarah and Running Wolf emerged from the teepee to begin final loading of their own mount and the small travois that would carry additional supplies. The military men watched with poorly concealed curiosity as Running Wolf efficiently secured their belongings, using techniques perfected through generations of Lakota mobile living. Sarah participated actively in these preparations, demonstrating through action rather than words that she was partner rather than passenger in this journey. She noticed Foster observing this dynamic with thoughtful attention, perhaps further adjusting his understanding of their relationship. The main trail should be passable, though muddy in sections, Foster commented as they completed preparations. We can reach Fort Pierre by nightfall if we maintain a steady pace. Running Wolf nodded agreement, though Sarah noted the subtle caution in his expression. They had discussed privately that military escorts typically prioritized speed over careful assessment of changing terrain conditions, a potential source of friction given Running Wolf's methodical approach to wilderness travel. With the teepee dismantled and essential components packaged for transport, Sarah took a final moment to survey the small clearing that had been their winter sanctuary. The physical evidence of their presence would soon disappear under spring growth, leaving only the concealed caches of non-essential items as tangible reminders of the months they had spent here. The land remembers even when traces vanish, Running Wolf commented softly, noting her contemplative farewell. As do we. The small party departed shortly after sunrise, Foster and one soldier riding ahead, Sarah and Running Wolf in the middle, and the remaining 2 soldiers following behind. This formation offered nominal protection while maintaining subtle surveillance, a diplomatic arrangement that acknowledged both security concerns and underlying suspicion. The journey progressed largely as Foster had predicted, following game. Trails that had evolved into more established pathways as they approached Fort Pierre. The spring thaw had indeed made travel challenging in sections where meltwater saturated the ground, but not impossible so. Throughout the day, Sarah observed the changing landscape with mixed emotions, appreciation for the beauty of awakening prairie interwoven with growing apprehension about the civilization they approached. Conversation remained minimal during travel, limited primarily to practical observations about route conditions and brief rest stops. By mid-afternoon, evidence of proximity to Fort Pierre became increasingly apparent. Occasional travelers passed in the opposite direction, remnants of hunting camps appeared more frequently, and eventually the smoke from the settlement itself became visible on the horizon. As they created a final ridge that offered a clear view of Fort Pierre spread along the Missouri River below, Foster called a brief halt. The settlement, larger than Sarah had anticipated, presented a striking contrast to the natural environment they had inhabited for months. Wooden buildings clustered near the river landing, with the fort itself standing slightly removed on higher ground. Wagons moved along muddy streets, and even at this distance, the evidence of active commerce was unmistakable. Home of civilization. In these parts, Foster commented, a note of pride evident in his voice. Not what you'd find back east, of course, but rapidly developing. Sarah studied the scene with complex emotions. After months in the serene isolation of their winter camp, the bustling settlement seemed almost overwhelmingly active, yet also represented access to resources and opportunities they would need for whatever path they ultimately pursued. Running Wolf's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts as he surveyed the fort and settlement, though Sarah had learned to recognize the subtle tension in his posture that indicated heightened vigilance. For him, Fort Pierre represented a boundary space between worlds, a place where he was neither fully accepted by white society nor entirely comfortable among those Lakota who maintained traditional separation from settler influences. As they began their final approach toward the settlement, Foster directed his horse alongside Sarah's. "I should prepare you, Mrs. Holloway. Your arrival will cause significant interest, especially given the unusual circumstances." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "The commander will likely wish to interview you immediately. Standard procedure in situations involving civilian safety." "I understand," Sarah replied calmly, "though I would appreciate the opportunity to refresh myself before such meetings, if possible." Foster nodded. "Of course, there's a boarding house run by Mrs. Lawson, a respectable establishment where single women of good standing can find accommodations. I'll arrange for you to be situated there before reporting to the commander." The unspoken implication was clear: immediate separation from Running Wolf upon reaching the settlement, with Sarah reintegrated into appropriate white female society as quickly as possible, before she could formulate a response that wouldn't antagonize their military escort while still asserting her autonomy. Running Wolf spoke. "The mission house may be more suitable," he suggested, in the measured tone he employed for diplomatic navigation. "Reverend Williamson knows me. His wife would provide proper chaperonage while respecting Mrs. Holloway's connection to both communities." The suggestion represented strategic brilliance, invoking Christian ministry as justification for arrangements that might otherwise challenge convention. Foster considered this with evident relief at the potential solution to his dilemma. "That might indeed be appropriate," he agreed. "Williamson has worked with both communities for years. His vouching for your situation would carry significant weight." Sarah exchanged a brief glance with Running Wolf, acknowledging the small victory in maintaining some control over their immediate circumstances upon reaching the settlement. The mission house represented neutral territory of sorts, neither fully integrated into military authority nor completely separate from respectable society. Their arrival at Fort Pierre provoked precisely the attention Foster had predicted. As they rode through the muddy main street toward the fort proper, settlers paused in their activities to observe the unusual party, particularly the white woman in adapted frontier clothing, traveling in the company of a Lakota man. Sarah maintained dignified composure despite the stares, neither hiding from scrutiny nor acknowledging it directly. At the fort entrance, Foster instructed his men to escort Running Wolf to the Indian Agency building, a designation that carried both practical logic and implicit segregation. Before they separated, Running Wolf approached Sarah briefly, speaking quietly in the Lakota language he had begun teaching her during their winter together. "Patience and wisdom," he advised, using simple phrases she understood. "The mission." At sundown, Sarah nodded, responding with one of the Lakota expressions she had mastered. "My heart remains strong." The brief exchange in his native language, conducted before witnesses, constituted both practical communication and symbolic statement of their continued connection despite forced separation. Foster politely pretended not to notice this interaction, as he personally escorted Sarah toward the commander's headquarters. "Colonel Richardson is a reasonable man," he offered as they walked, "experienced with frontier complexities." The assessment provided small comfort as Sarah prepared to defend choices that frontier military authority would likely find difficult to comprehend. Her months with Running Wolf had transformed her understanding of herself, her capabilities, and her purpose. But communicating that transformation to those entrenched in conventional perspectives would present a significant challenge. Colonel James Richardson proved physically imposing, a barrel-chested man with impressive mustaches and the weathered complexion of someone who had served many years in harsh environments. His office combined military functionality with personal touches suggesting longer-term residence than typical frontier postings. Bookshelves containing volumes beyond tactical manuals, a decent quality chess set in the corner, and surprisingly good furnishings for such a remote location. "Mrs. Holloway," he greeted her with formal courtesy after Foster had made introductions and excused himself. "Please be seated. I understand you've had quite an extraordinary experience these past months." Sarah took the offered chair, maintaining composed dignity despite her travel-worn appearance and awareness of the power imbalance in this interaction. "Extraordinary circumstances sometimes reveal extraordinary possibilities, Colonel," she replied, establishing from the outset that she would engage as an equal participant rather than passive subject of investigation. Richardson's bushy eyebrows rose slightly at her measured confidence. "Indeed. Perhaps you might share your perspective on these circumstances. I've received Mr. Carter's rather colorful account and will soon review Lieutenant Foster's report, but would value hearing directly from you." The invitation, while officially necessary, suggested potential openness to narrative beyond what Carter had undoubtedly provided. Sarah recognized the critical importance of this conversation in shaping official understanding of her situation, and by extension, the options that might remain available to her and Running Wolf moving forward. Taking a measured breath, Sarah began her account, neither apologetic nor confrontational, but straightforward about the abandonment by Whispering Pines, her desperate attempt to reach Hope's Crossing, and Running Wolf's intervention that saved her life. She described their winter arrangement with dignified clarity, emphasizing the educational exchange that had formed its foundation and the mutual respect that had developed through shared survival challenges. "So you see, Colonel," she concluded, "what began as rescue became partnership based on recognition of each other's knowledge and capabilities. I chose to remain with Mr. Wolf after recovery became possible because our arrangement offered dignity and purpose that my previous community had denied following my husband's death." Richardson had listened without interruption, his expression revealing little beyond attentive consideration. When Sarah finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled before him in contemplative gesture. "A remarkable narrative, Mrs. Holloway, one that differs significantly from certain assumptions." He studied her with evaluating gaze. "You were a teacher in this Whispering Pines settlement?" "Yes, formerly educated at Oberlin College in Ohio, before marrying and coming west with my husband." This information clearly registered with Richardson, perhaps elevating her account from mere frontier oddity to consideration as informed perspective. "And your future intentions. Surely you recognize that conventional society would find continued association with a Lakota man problematic. My intention, Colonel, is to continue teaching, providing education that bridges understanding between cultures increasingly forced into interaction." Sarah met his gaze directly. "Whether through formal school, mission outreach, or other arrangement where such knowledge serves community needs." Richardson nodded thoughtfully. "Noble aspiration, though practically complicated in current circumstances." He rose, moving to gaze briefly through his office window at the fort grounds below. "These territories stand at precarious juncture, Mrs. Holloway. Tensions between settlers and native populations increase daily, particularly with rumors of gold in the Black Hills drawing fortune seekers despite treaty prohibitions." He turned back to face her. "In such a climate, unusual arrangements between individuals of different backgrounds attract disproportionate attention, potentially inflaming sentiments on both sides." The observation, while diplomatically phrased, contained unmistakable warning about challenges her proposed path would face. Sarah acknowledged this reality with a nod. Difficult times often require new approaches, Colonel. Perhaps education that promotes understanding rather than division might contribute to easing such tensions. A ghost of a smile appeared beneath Richardson's impressive mustaches. Idealism tempered with practical capability can indeed be a powerful force, Mrs. Holloway. He returned to his desk, making brief notations on a document before continuing. For now, I've approved Lieutenant Foster's recommendation that you be accommodated at Reverend Williamson's mission until more permanent arrangements can be determined. The decision represented neither victory nor defeat, but temporary reprieve. Space to regroup and assess options within a semi-protected environment. Sarah expressed appropriate gratitude while recognizing that significant challenges remained ahead. As she departed the colonel's office, escorted by a young corporal assigned to guide her to the mission house, Sarah felt a curious mixture of apprehension and hope. The official reception had been less condemning than she might reasonably have feared, yet the underlying message remained clear. Her relationship with Running Wolf represented problematic deviation from acceptable social boundaries, one that would face continuing scrutiny and pressure toward conventional resolution. The mission house, a modest but well-maintained structure near the settlement's edge, presented a welcome contrast to military formality. Martha Williamson, the Reverend's wife, welcomed Sarah with genuine warmth that transcended obvious curiosity about her unusual circumstances. "You must be exhausted, my dear," the older woman observed, leading Sarah to a small but clean guest room. "Rest now, refresh yourself. There will be ample time for explanations and decisions in the days ahead." The simple kindness, offering space rather than immediate interrogation, brought unexpected emotion to Sarah's throat. After months of self-sufficiency and harsh conditions, this small act of normal human consideration reminded her of social connections beyond survival partnership. "Thank you," she managed, accepting the towel, wash basin, and simple change of clothing Martha provided. "Your hospitality means more than I can express." "We serve where needed," Martha replied simply. "My husband will return at sundown. Until then, consider this room your sanctuary." Left alone, Sarah sank onto the narrow bed, the events of the day suddenly catching up with her. Fort Pierre represented safety in conventional terms, protection from winter's deadly cold, from potential hostile encounters in contested territory, from the physical privations of frontier survival. Yet it also brought new dangers to the connection she had formed with Running Wolf: social pressures, institutional biases, and systematic boundaries between worlds they had temporarily transcended. As afternoon light slanted through the small window, Sarah allowed exhaustion to claim her temporarily, knowing that evening would bring reunion with Running Wolf at the mission house, and with it, the next phase of their journey toward defining what might be possible at the intersection of their different worlds. Whatever challenges awaited, she would face them not as the desperate widow abandoned by whispering pines, but as a woman transformed by months of learning to survive, adapt, and ultimately thrive in circumstances that should have defeated her. The path forward remained uncertain, but Sarah Holloway now walked it with confidence, born of knowing her own capabilities, and with partnership that transcended conventional understanding. The winter that should have claimed her life had instead revealed new possibilities for living it fully, with purpose that honored both her own heritage of education and the profound wisdom she had discovered in a culture previously unknown to her. That discovery would not be easily surrendered, regardless of what obstacles Fort Pierre and the wider world might place in its path. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.